Hello, my dear friends. In a place of supreme power and tens of kilos of dresses, the Queen can go a month without touching a drop of water. Not because she is busy, but because she is afraid of bathing. Behind the scent of roses is sweat soaked deep into the silk. Behind the fragrant gloves is a layer of powder that has not been washed for a week. The palace is bright, but under the velvet curtains, on the feather pillows, is a smell that history has not recorded. Tonight, you will step into the real backstage of the royal family, where secrets are not washed clean. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. If you've ever pictured a royal woman stepping out of a velvet-draped carriage, walking past marble columns into a candlelit palace chamber, you probably imagined grace, clean skin, powdered cheeks, maybe a soft scent of lavender following her into the room. What rarely makes it into those fantasies is what she smelled like underneath all of that, or rather, what she didn't do to change it. Because for many royal women across centuries, hygiene wasn't a priority. It was almost treated like an afterthought. And not because they didn't care about appearances, they cared about them too much. But when it came to getting clean, to using soap and water, things became complicated. The first and possibly most surprising fact is that royal women didn't bathe very often, not even monthly. In some cases, barely once a year. This wasn't laziness, it was a belief. Doctors in the Middle Ages and even through the Renaissance warned that bathing could weaken the body. They thought water opened the pores, letting in disease. So instead of washing, women covered up. They used perfumes, powders, and oils to build a kind of fragrant barrier between themselves and the outside world. A royal woman didn't step into a tub of soap and bubbles. She stepped into a cloud of rosewater and civet, and that, somehow, was considered more refined. Perfume wasn't just an accessory, it was a shield. At the French court of Louis XIV, for example, nobles were known to reapply scent several times a day. Their dresses were soaked in floral waters, their gloves were lined with herbs, their hair was sprinkled with crushed flowers and sometimes even powdered bone. The goal was never to cleanse, only to conceal. One royal mistress proudly claimed to have only bathed twice in her life. Once when she was born, and once on her wedding night. No one found that strange. It was almost admirable. Why take a risk with water when you could just add more fragrance? Of course, this created a layering effect. Each day added another coat of oil, another dab of musk, another spritz of something floral. The result wasn't always pleasant. Behind the satin curtains and embroidered pillows, there was often a noticeable heaviness in the air. It smelled like orange blossoms, yes, but also like wool, like sweat, like something you couldn't quite place, but wouldn't want to breathe in too deeply. Still, guests smiled, they nodded, they complimented the scent, because to comment otherwise was to insult the court. The royal baths themselves, when they existed, were more symbolic than practical, made of marble or stone, with golden taps and carved lions' heads. They looked impressive, but they weren't used often. A queen might step into one on a ceremonial occasion. She might soak for half an hour in perfumed oils, then step out without ever touching a bar of soap. The water, reused for multiple baths, often sat cloudy and stale. Towels, if used, were decorative, embroidered, perfumed, sometimes stiff with starch. They were not absorbent. Many women simply stood by a fire afterward and waited to dry. And drying took time, especially when wearing layers. A standard outfit could include 5 or 6 garments, underdresses, corsets, overskirts, and cloaks, each one heavy, each one holding on to moisture like a sponge. So the goal was to avoid getting wet in the first place. The fewer times the body touched water, the easier the day. That was the logic. The body wasn't scrubbed, it was dabbed, it was painted, it was wrapped in lace and silk and expected to behave. Under all of this, the skin had to manage on its own. Royal women developed techniques to handle rashes, itching, and other consequences of rarely washing. Powders were used to soothe, but also to hide. A rash might be sprinkled with starch or covered with a beauty patch. If the skin broke out, it was covered with white lead. If it blistered, a little rouge helped blur the edges. Nothing was healed, only hidden. Appearance mattered more than comfort. Even the servants who helped dress these women learned to work without mentioning the smell. They learned how to fasten laces without pulling too hard on raw skin. They knew when to bring a fresh linen cloth and when to hold back. There were unspoken rules about what could be said loud. A queen might faint from heat and perfume, but no one blamed the corset or the musk. They simply opened a window and carried on. Sometimes, these hygiene habits led to infections. Skin broke down under the weight of unwashed fabric. Hair thinned from repeated layers of pomade and powder. But none of this showed in portraits. There, the royal woman looked perfect. Smooth cheeks, shiny curls, calm eyes. No one painted the sores or the bruises beneath the gown. The contradiction was clear, but accepted. To be royal was to look beautiful, not to be clean. Even cleanliness itself became suspicious. Washing too often was seen as vain, or worse, unnatural. A woman who washed daily might be compared to a courtesan. A queen who washed monthly was considered cautious, and the rest simply powdered, perfumed, and hoped for the best. What's curious is how normal this seemed at the time. No one questioned it. Royal women were taught from childhood to avoid water, to layer oils, to sit in scented smoke rather than steam. They weren't careless. They were following the best advice available. Even as they scratched beneath their pearls or blinked through the sting of their perfume, they believed they were doing the right thing. It's easy now to look back and laugh, to imagine the halls of Versailles as floral-smelling hothouses of discomfort. But in truth, they were elegant. They were admired. They were copied by courts across Europe. The smell was simply part of the package, and over time it became invisible. The way background noise fades if you listen to it long enough. So if you've ever pictured yourself in a royal gown, walking through a candlelit palace, maybe take a moment to imagine what that would feel like. The weight of the dress, the heat of the room, the thick scent that clings to your sleeves and doesn't let go, and maybe, just maybe, you'll start to appreciate your soap a little more. Because, as we'll see in the next part, this was only the beginning. Under the gowns and the gloves, there was still more to hide, and even less to clean. And so, beneath all the satin and perfume, there was always more to cover, and more to avoid. One of the most curious things about royal hygiene was not what they did, but what they refused to do. Among these refusals, one stands out quite clearly: washing their clothing. Not just the grand outer garments, which were delicate and expensive, but also the underlayers, the clothes worn closest to the skin, the ones that collected every drop of sweat, every trace of body heat, every lingering scent of roast meat or rose water. These clothes, instead of being scrubbed and boiled like a washwoman might do, were handled with a different approach, an approach that involved patience, a sunny day, and sometimes a prayer. In most royal households, linen undergarments were considered self-cleaning. Not literally, of course, but close enough. It was believed that if you hung them in the breeze and let them air out properly, the sun and wind would take care of any unpleasantness. Washing them too frequently was seen as both unnecessary and dangerous. Hot water could weaken the fibres. Strong soap could ruin the fabric. Scrubbing was out of the question. Instead, they were gently brushed, maybe dabbed with a cloth soaked in alcohol or perfume, and then laid out on a chair by the window. That was enough. Supposedly, there are records of queens wearing the same shift for several days, sometimes even weeks, before allowing it to be refreshed. And refreshed rarely meant washed. It meant shaken out, sprayed with something floral, and occasionally rubbed with herbs. Lavender was a favourite, rosemary too, a little lemon balm if someone was feeling extra cautious, but soap and water, not unless necessary, and necessary usually meant visible stains, or smells so strong that even the servants began to notice. Of course, these undergarments were not simple things. They were carefully stitched, often embroidered, sometimes even perfumed at the time of their making. A queen's chemise might be trimmed with lace or edged with tiny pearls. It wasn't just clothing, it was part of her image, but it was still linen, still cloth, still something that touched her skin day after day. The fact that it wasn't regularly washed didn't mean it stayed clean. It just meant people pretended not to see, and so, in a court where appearances mattered more than comfort, there developed a kind of polite blindness. Everyone agreed to ignore the reality beneath the silk and brocade, the layers of unwashed linen, the stiff corsets that held in more than just a waistline, the secret stains, the dampness in the folds. It wasn't elegant, but it was accepted. No one spoke of it aloud, not unless they were writing letters home, far from the ears of court gossip. Some chambermaids kept quiet simply because they had no other choice. Their job was to fold the chemises, fasten the corsets, and carry out the perfumed cloths for airing. They weren't allowed to criticise. A wrinkled nose or a stray comment could mean dismissal, and for many of these women, a place in the Queen's household was the highest position they could hope to achieve. So they powdered, they brushed, they aired, and they stayed silent. In rare cases, when garments truly couldn't be salvaged, they were not cleaned, they were replaced, especially with underthings. A torn chemise might be cut into rags and sent to the scullery. A badly stained petticoat quietly burned in the fire. New ones were ordered. The idea was not to preserve, but to maintain the illusion. And that illusion was of a woman who was always fresh, always composed, and always just scented enough. But the truth lay in the seams. The longer something was worn, the more it absorbed. Not just sweat, but stress. Not just perfume, but fear. The court was not a relaxing place. Women sat through hours of ceremonies, stood through banquets, danced under hot chandeliers, all while tightly wrapped in fabric that refused to breathe. And when they returned to their rooms at night, they didn't undress and throw their clothing into a laundry basket. They unfastened it carefully, laid it out to air, and sometimes wore it again before breakfast. Even Elizabeth I, known for her meticulous appearance, had her undergarments cleaned sparingly. Some letters suggest that her laundresses used breadcrumbs to rub away marks. Not soap, not scrubbing, just gentle friction. A kind of royal dry cleaning, using kitchen supplies. One wonders if the birds in the garden noticed anything unusual about their morning crumbs. There were other methods too. Some women stored sachets of dried herbs in their drawers and chests. Others pressed ironed clothes between layers to absorb excess oil. A few even placed slices of lemon or orange peel in their closets. Not because they thought it would clean the fabric, but because the smell distracted from what wasn't clean. This was seen as a strategy, a way to redirect attention from what couldn't be fixed. And still, nobody questioned the system. They simply followed it, generation after generation. Advice passed down from mother to daughter, noblewoman to lady-in-waiting. Wash a little, air often, scent everything. And if it begins to smell too much like life, add more lavender, more rose petals, more powdered clove. Today, we might find this difficult to believe. We talk about hygiene like it's basic, like it's instinct. But for centuries, it wasn't. It was luxury. It was dangerous. It was something best handled at a distance. For royal women, cleanliness was not about soap. It was about illusion. If no one mentioned the smell, then maybe it wasn't there. And so, night after night, beneath ceiling carvings and silk canopies, queens and princesses lay down in garments that had never been truly clean. They tucked themselves into beds lined with sheets that had been aired but not washed. They closed their eyes under blankets that smelled of cloves and camphor and memory, and they slept, as well as anyone could, knowing that the next day they would rise, powder themselves once more, and pretend. Because pretending, more than perfume, was the true foundation of royal hygiene. And in the next part, we'll step even further into that world of cover-ups and contradictions, to a place where perfume wasn't worn, but carried. Not just for beauty, but for survival. If perfume was the first layer of illusion, then accessories were the second. In the royal courts of Europe, especially during the 16th and 17th centuries, smell was not just a matter of vanity, it was a tool, a shield, sometimes even a weapon. And for women who had very little real power, scent became a quiet language. It told people where you stood, it announced your presence before you entered a room, and when needed, it protected you from the less charming realities of palace life. One of the most common tools in this quiet olfactory battle was the pomander, a small metal ball, often ornate, worn on a chain or tucked into a gown. Inside, it held a tightly packed mixture of herbs, resins, and dried flowers, clove, cinnamon, ambergris, rosemary. These were the most popular, chosen for their strong lingering smells. When the air grew thick with candle smoke and sweat, a lady could simply lift her pomander to her nose and breathe something better. The fashion spread fast. At court, it was nearly expected. A woman without a pomander was either new or forgetful. Some wore theirs on long chains, swinging from the waist. Others kept them hidden in sleeves, close to the pulse. A few carried small perfumed cloths instead, laced with the same herbs and tucked into gloved hands. All of these served the same purpose, to give a moment of relief from a world that didn't believe in ventilation. And it wasn't just about comfort. People genuinely believed that bad smells could cause disease. The idea of miasma was deeply rooted. If you walked past a sick room and inhaled something foul, it wasn't just unpleasant, it was dangerous. So, surrounding yourself with good smells was more than etiquette. It was protection, a kind of invisible armour. Elizabeth, I kept her rooms filled with potpourri and perfumed gloves. Her bedding was layered with sachets of dried lavender and herbs. Even her servants were instructed to keep scented cloths nearby. The goal was to maintain a space that smelled not just pleasant, but powerful. And the smell of power, it seemed, was a mix of roses, cloves, and a hint of desperation. Perfumed gloves were particularly popular. At first, they were a practical solution. Tanned leather didn't smell very nice, so glove makers began soaking their products in floral oils and spice infusions. Over time, these gloves became a fashion statement, a gift from one noble to another, a token of favour or affection. But they also had a more subtle function. Worn over hands that rarely touched soap and water, they helped hide whatever the sleeves could not. In some cases, the gloves were so saturated with perfume that they stained the skin. One ambassador reportedly complained that after shaking hands with a French duchess, he smelled of ambergris for the rest of the day. He didn't say whether he minded, only that the scent lingered longer than her conversation. Of course, not all smells could be managed so neatly. The royal palaces were busy places. Hundreds of people, animals, fires, meals, and open windows are all competing for the same air. Scented accessories helped, but they didn't erase the source. They just floated above it, like a polite lie. A distraction that made it easier to smile through a headache. To make things worse, many of these perfumes were made with ingredients that would horrify modern noses. Musk, for example, was harvested from the glands of animals. Ambergris comes from the digestive systems of whales. Civet was collected from the scent sacs of a small African mammal. These were expensive, rare, and considered luxurious, but they were also pungent, and sometimes even overwhelming. A little too much musk could clear a hallway faster than a poorly cooked roast. Still, women wore these scents proudly. They dabbed them on handkerchiefs, sprinkled them onto pillows, pressed them into hairpieces. Some even burned scented paste on small plates to fill the room before guests arrived. The goal was always the same: to create an atmosphere that felt clean, even if it wasn't. To convince both visitor and resident that beauty still reigned, even as the carpets held decades of dust. There's something quietly impressive about how committed they were to this system. They knew the clothes weren't clean. They knew the baths were rare. They knew the air was thick. And yet, they didn't give up. They just worked harder to hide it. Another ribbon, another sprig of herbs, another dip of the gloves into violet oil. It's tempting to laugh at all of this now, to imagine women walking through palaces like mobile spice racks. But there's also something relatable here. The need to control what little you can. To carve out a pocket of comfort in an environment you didn't design. For royal women, perfume wasn't an indulgence. It was survival. And maybe, in a court full of watching eyes and whispered judgment, smelling right mattered more than being right. A woman who carried the right scent might be remembered. One who didn't might be replaced. The truth is, royal courts were full of contradictions. They demanded perfection, but gave women few tools to achieve it. They admired beauty, but discouraged real maintenance. They expected grace, but provided no privacy. So women did what they could. They powdered. They perfumed. They stitched herbs into the lining of their dresses. They held pomanders to their faces and hoped the rest of the world wouldn't notice how hard they were trying. Because even if no one said it aloud, everyone knew. A pleasant smell was a social currency, a way of saying, I belong here. I understand the rules. I might not have control over the water, or the walls, or the rules that govern my life, but I can choose how I smell, and sometimes that was enough. The irony, of course, is that some of these fragrances caused their problems. They irritated the skin, they triggered coughing fits, in rare cases, they even caused fainting. But by the time anyone realised, the trend had already taken hold, and no one wanted to be the first to give it up. So the gloves stayed on, the herbs stayed tucked, the pomanders clicked quietly at the waist, swinging with each careful step through marble halls that smelled, underneath it all, like too many people and not enough soap. And in the next part, we'll see what happened when the smells were no longer a private matter, but something everyone in the room had to manage, including the Queen herself. By now, the court had grown used to pretending that everything smelled fine, that perfume solved everything, that a cloud of rose oil was enough to erase a month's worth of sweat under brocade. But sometimes, pretending wasn't enough. Sometimes, the problem didn't stay hidden behind silk. Sometimes, it made itself known in ways no pomander could fix. And that's when things got interesting. Because when the Queen herself had to go, the entire court had to pretend they didn't notice. Before modern plumbing, every royal residence had its way of dealing with nature's call. The chamber pot was the Queen's constant companion, discreet, portable, ceramic or pewter, and almost always disguised to look like something else. It might be tucked behind a privacy screen or placed beside a velvet-covered stool. It might even have a lid that clicked shut like a jewellery box. But it was still a pot, and it still had a job to do. In the middle of a long reception, a banquet, or a council meeting, the Queen couldn't excuse herself casually. There were no quiet hallways or nearby bathrooms. If she needed relief, she used what was available, and what was available was often close by. A lady-in-waiting would know the signs. She would gather the cloth, draw the screen, and everyone else would stare pointedly at the ceiling while trying to breathe through a scented handkerchief. This wasn't scandalous. It was routine. The court knew how to choreograph around it. Musicians played louder, pages shifted in and out, servants passed with trays, shielding the view. The moment passed. The curtain was drawn back, and the Queen continued as though nothing had happened. Everyone nodded and carried on. because pretending was polite. Pretending was survival. Afterward, the pot was taken away by servants trained in silence. They didn't speak. They didn't flinch. They didn't wrinkle their noses. They simply lifted the porcelain, held it steady, and walked carefully through the corridor until they reached a place no one wanted to think about. Some palaces had designated disposal chambers. Others had holes in the floor leading to collection pits. Either way, it was not a glamorous job, but it had to be done. And the smell that didn't just disappear, no matter how much perfume was sprayed afterward, it lingered, especially in heavy fabrics, especially in tapestries that hadn't been cleaned since the last rain. Even the thick stone walls soaked it in. So, courtiers began to carry scented fans, not just for heat, but to wave something pleasant toward their faces, to create a tiny breeze of denial in a room where denial was the main course. Elizabeth I had her system. She was said to keep perfumed gloves at her writing desk and dried herbs near her bedside. When she travelled, she brought her bedding, laced with lavender and camphor. But even she wasn't immune to the realities of palace life. There were times when she, too, had to pause a meeting, disappear behind a velvet screen, and trust that her ladies would keep the performance intact. And they did. Every time. Because a breach in decorum wasn't just embarrassing. It was dangerous. A moment of weakness could be interpreted as illness, and illness meant vulnerability. In a court full of hungry eyes, even the act of relieving oneself had to be wrapped in grace. It had to look like nothing had happened. It had to leave no trace. That's where accessories came back into play. Scented handkerchiefs were essential. Pomanders hung at the waist. Sprigs of herbs were stitched into sleeves. Some women even wore small pouches filled with mint and crushed petals inside their bodices, close to the skin. These weren't fashion choices. They were survival kits, weapons in the quiet war against smell. But smell wasn't the only thing at stake. There was also noise. In a silent chamber, a sound out of place could shift attention. So servants learned to hum softly, to drop something at just the right moment, to cough, move a chair, or open a window. Every motion was practiced. Every distraction is carefully timed. The goal was not just to hide what was happening, but to maintain the illusion that nothing ever needed to happen. This wasn't unique to England. Across Europe, royal women developed their codes. In France, the phrase "retired to her chamber" became a delicate way to explain an absence. In Spain, "she takes the air" often meant the queen had gone to a private corner with her trusted servant and a bucket disguised as a stool. The Austrians, ever precise, used bells to signal transitions, giving everyone enough time to turn politely away. The reality, of course, was that even queens are human, and no amount of civet oil or jasmine-scented gloves could change that. They sweated, they digested, they released. And then they powdered their cheeks, straightened their posture, and rejoined the room like nothing had ever happened. It's not surprising, then, that court etiquette books began to include entire sections on managing these moments. There were diagrams for arranging screens, instructions for folding cloth, recommendations for which scents worked best in summer. It became its system, a performance within the performance. Some courtiers took pride in mastering this dance. They could spot the moment a queen shifted in her seat. They knew how to pass a fresh cloth without drawing attention. They could refill the pot with rose water and return it without a sound. For them, invisibility was a talent, and the ability to pretend nothing smelled was a virtue. But for all their effort, the truth didn't disappear. It hung in the air, just faintly, just enough to remind everyone that the palace, for all its gold and grandeur, was still a building full of people. People are wearing too many layers. People are eating too much meat. People sharing small spaces with large consequences. Still, no one complained, at least not publicly, because to admit the Queen's chamber smelled like anything other than violets was to risk your position. So, ambassadors wrote their letters in private. Servants whispered in corners. and the rest of the court learned to live with it, or rather, to not mention it. After all, what was the alternative? Ask the Queen to wash more, suggest plumbing, recommend soap. No one was foolish enough to try. Instead, they adjusted. They learned to breathe shallowly. They learned to smile without sniffing. And they learned to praise the scent of roses, even when the room smelled more like life. In the next part, we'll move from what was happening behind the curtain to what was happening on the surface, because once the perfumes faded, the powders began. And if you think hiding smell was difficult, try hiding your skin. Powder was everywhere. It clung to faces, settled on collars, floated in the air like soft dust. In the royal courts of Europe, powder wasn't just part of a beauty routine, it was the routine. Applied with careful hands and serious intentions, it turned pale skin into porcelain, dark circles into smooth surfaces, and blemishes into something politely ignored, at least from a distance. Up close, the illusion didn't always hold, but that didn't matter, because at court, distance was part of the performance, and powder helped keep that performance alive. For royal women, pale skin wasn't just fashionable, it was necessary. A fair complexion suggested wealth, refinement, and the luxury of staying indoors. It marked you as someone who didn't need to work under the sun, someone who didn't sweat like a baker or smell like a stable. But achieving that look took more than good lighting. It took layers, and the ingredients in those layers were rarely kind. The most common foundation was made of white lead, mixed with vinegar, water, and sometimes even egg whites. It created a creamy paste that clung to the skin. The result was smooth, bright, and deadly. White lead is toxic, slowly, quietly toxic. It seeps into the skin, damages tissue, and weakens the immune system. But at the time, no one questioned it, because it worked. It covered scars, smoothed over smallpox marks, and gave the appearance of health, which, ironically, was destroying it. Rouge was next, a dab on each cheek, sometimes made from crushed beetles, sometimes from mercury-based compounds, just enough to look alive, just enough to balance the pale base without looking like you'd been walking too fast. Lip colour came last, a touch of red, made from cinnabar or plant dyes, applied with a small brush or fingertip. The whole process took time, and a steady hand, and occasionally a second person to assist with the angles. These cosmetics didn't come off easily. Most weren't meant to. Women slept in them, added more the next morning, touched up between meals. Washing it all off meant using oils, vinegar, or cloth soaked in alcohol, not water. Never water. That was still seen as risky. And so, instead of removing old layers, they added new ones, powder for powder, week after week. Eventually, the skin suffered. It blistered, cracked, and turned grey around the edges. In some portraits, you can see the damage if you look closely. A certain tightness in the jaw, a slight swelling under the eye. But painters were kind. They smoothed it out with their brushes, and the myth of flawless skin continued. To cover the worst of it, women used beauty patches, small shapes made from velvet, silk, or wax, placed carefully on the face, a star near the temple, a crescent by the mouth, a circle under the eye. They served a double purpose. Decoration, yes, but also concealment. A blister beneath a heart-shaped patch looked like fashion, not infection. The use of these patches became so common that they developed meanings. A patch on the right cheek meant flirtation, on the left, loyalty. Near the lips, secret desire. It became a game, a silent language spoken through felt and glue. But beneath the messages was a quieter truth. These patches were often hiding things no one wanted to talk about. Skin that had been powdered too many times, treated with too much mercury, scrubbed with too little care. And still, the powder kept coming. Each morning, Maids opened boxes of pressed lead, stirred bowls of rouge, cut fresh patches from black silk. They fanned away the residue that floated in the air, settled on furniture, and stuck to curtains. Some women developed coughs that never left. Some lost hair, others lost teeth. But they rarely blamed the powder. They blamed the air, the season, their nerves, anything but the thing they applied each day. It wasn't just vanity, it was an expectation. A woman who showed up to court without her face properly prepared might be described as tired, or worse, rude. Not putting in the effort was seen as a kind of insult. To the Queen, to the occasion, to the entire structure of noble life. So women kept powdering, even as their skin begged for air, even as their reflection stopped looking like themselves. Elizabeth I was known for her commitment to the powdered look. She had suffered from smallpox early in life, and though she survived, the scars never left her face. Instead of hiding away, she leaned into artifice. She wore thick white paste, heavy rouge, and elaborate wigs to distract. From a distance, she looked regal. Up close, the cracks showed, but no one dared mention them. Some courtiers took note in their private letters. One ambassador described her skin as strained porcelain. Another mentioned her eyes always seemed watery, as if irritated. But they wrote these things carefully, respectfully. Because to criticise a queen's appearance was to question her power, and powder, in its strange way, was part of that power. There's a quiet irony in all of this. In trying to look strong, they weakened themselves. In trying to appear untouched, they covered the very damage the court inflicted. But the alternative wasn't appealing. To show natural skin was unthinkable. It suggested poverty, illness, madness, even. So they painted on health. They powered on, and hoped the mirror would cooperate. Some women tried to modernise. They experimented with gentler mixtures, rice powder, ground pearl. But these were expensive, hard to find, and didn't cover as well. So they often returned to what they knew: lead, mercury, whatever it took. Because when beauty is expected, health becomes negotiable. Today, we think of makeup as a choice, a form of expression. But for these women, it was a mask they couldn't remove, not without consequences. It was survival in powdered form. A layer between them and judgment. And in the next part, we'll look at what happened when even the powder wasn't enough. When the damage beneath had to be dealt with, not just covered. A chapter that takes us into the world of teeth, and all the creative ways royal women tried to keep smiling, even when their mouths told a different story. The smile was expected, at banquets, at balls, during royal audiences. A calm, pleasant expression, composed lips, slightly parted, just enough to suggest warmth without effort. But beneath that soft smile, something else was going on. Because under the powder, past the rouge, behind the pearls and lace, royal teeth were quietly falling apart. Tooth decay was a fact of life in the royal courts. Sugar, once rare, became fashionable during the Renaissance and exploded in popularity by the 17th century. It was expensive, yes, but the rich had no shortage of it. Candied fruits, sweetened wine, honey-drenched pastries. These weren't occasional treats. They were daily indulgences, and the teeth paid the price. Dentistry, as we know it, did not exist. Toothbrushes were crude if they existed at all. Some used twigs with frayed ends. Others rubbed their teeth with linen cloths. A few had access to bristle brushes, often made from hog hair, but they were not widely used. More common was the use of powders. These could be made from ground eggshells, burnt bread, chalk, coral, or pumice. Applied with a cloth or fingertip, they were rough, gritty, and sometimes painful, but they gave the illusion of polish. The irony is that many of these powders did more harm than good. They stripped enamel, they irritated the gums, they created small cuts where food and bacteria could settle. Over time, teeth darkened, they loosened, they broke. But people didn't stop using the powders, because even with the damage, white teeth meant youth. And in court, youth was currency. When teeth fell out, and they often did, replacements were improvised. Ivory, bone, and even wood were carved to fit. Some sets were wired into place. Others were attached to existing teeth with metal clasps. None were comfortable. Most were only worn for short appearances, smiling for a portrait, posing at a feast, greeting a visiting noble. Afterward, they were removed, cleaned with wine or vinegar, and stored until the next occasion. There were even reports of teeth being taken from the mouths of the poor or dead. These donor teeth were sold to the wealthy, cleaned as best as possible, and inserted where needed. It wasn't hygienic, it wasn't safe, but it was effective enough. For a few months, maybe a year, until infection set in, or the gums rejected the foreign body. Then it was back to soft foods and tight-lipped smiles. Elizabeth, I was known to have suffered from tooth decay later in life. Some accounts describe her face as sunken, her speech slightly slurred, but she maintained appearances. She adjusted her makeup. She smiled carefully. She kept her distance when needed, because showing weakness, especially the kind that came from the mouth, was not acceptable. It suggested an age, decline, mortality, things no ruler wanted to admit. To help with the smell, people turned to breath fresheners. These weren't mints as we know them. They were concoctions of herbs, spices, and alcohol. Some chewed on cloves or fennel seeds, others were rinsed with vinegar or wine. A few kept sprigs of mint tucked inside their cheeks during events. The goal wasn't freshness, it was a disguise. If it didn't smell bad, it must be clean. At least that was the hope. One particularly theatrical solution was tooth jewels. When gaps appeared, some women glued small gems, pearls, rubies, even diamonds to their remaining teeth. The idea was to draw attention away from what was missing, to make the mouth sparkle. Even if the gums ached, it was not practical. The jewels often fell off, were swallowed, or had to be reapplied constantly. But for a moment, they were distracted, and in court, distraction was almost as valuable as beauty. To avoid losing more teeth, some women tried to eat less: soups, soft bread, stewed vegetables. But royal feasts didn't help. Meats were rich, desserts were sticky. Dishes were coated in sauces. The chewing never stopped, and with it, the slow erosion of dental health. No matter how gently they dabbed with vinegar or rubbed with a cloth, the damage continued. There were also attempts at pain relief. Toothaches were common and could be debilitating. Clove oil was applied directly to the gums. Alcohol-soaked cloths were pressed against the jaw. Some even turned to early forms of opium when available. But most suffered in silence. The Queen could not cancel a council meeting because her mouth hurt. She simply smiled through it, or pretended to. Portraits from this era rarely show teeth. When mouths are visible, they're closed, controlled. The ideal noble smile was one of calm restraint, not because restraint was elegant, but because anything more revealed too much. A missing molar, a discoloured incisor, a crooked bite. Better to keep the lips sealed and let the pearls do the talking. Some women wore veils or fans to hide their faces at certain angles. Others avoided conversation altogether. If a courtier leaned in too closely, there was a discreet step back, a pivot. A hand lifted with a scented glove. It became a silent dance, protecting one's image, one's dignity, one's decaying mouth, all without breaking the rhythm of court life. And yet, they endured. They learned how to smile without showing teeth, how to speak without opening wide, how to laugh behind a hand or a fan. Because in a world where everything was performance, even a damaged mouth had to be managed with grace. It's easy now to marvel at the inventions of modern dentistry: toothpaste, floss, and antiseptic rinse. But back then, the options were limited. Pain was normal, decay was expected, and beauty, once again, meant pretending. Pretending the teeth hadn't gone. Pretending the smile still held. So the next time you brush your teeth, consider this. Consider the court lady holding a ruby-studded toothpick. The queen is rinsing her mouth with red wine. The maid was scrubbing a wooden denture with a cloth dipped in lavender oil. They weren't careless. They were doing their best, with what they had, in the place they lived. And in the next part, we'll move from the mouth to something even more ambitious, the full body. Because as much as they tried to cover their skin with powder, they also tried to fix what they thought was wrong inside. And that meant turning to medicine, the kind that came with leeches, lancets, and far too much blood. When powder and perfume could no longer hide what the body carried, and when smiles became too painful to maintain, royal women turned to the one solution they believed might fix what lay beneath the skin. They turned to medicine, or rather, to what passed for medicine in their world, a world where balance was everything, and where imbalance had only one answer: release. Bloodletting was one of the most common medical practices among royalty. It was used to treat fevers, fatigue, rashes, mood swings, digestive issues, and even melancholy. Almost any discomfort, if left unexplained, could be blamed on too much blood. The logic followed the ancient belief in the four humours of the body: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. To be healthy was to keep them in balance, and when blood seemed to rise above the rest, it had to be let out. The process was not subtle. It involved sharp tools, careful timing, and a remarkable amount of ceremony. Royal physicians did not simply poke and hope. They used ornate lancets, often made of silver or gold, sometimes engraved with coats of arms. These were not just medical instruments. They were symbols of authority, of control, of precision. But no matter how beautiful the handle, the blade still pierced skin. The location of the cut mattered. The arm was common, especially near the elbow. The foot was used for certain ailments. In more serious cases, the neck or behind the ear. The chosen spot depended on what the physician believed needed balancing, and often it depended on the phase of the moon. Astrology played a quiet but persistent role in royal medicine. A poor alignment might delay the procedure. A favourable one might encourage extra sessions. Royal women did not always go willingly, but they were expected to submit, especially when symptoms became visible. A swelling in the joints, a persistent rash, a sudden change in temperament. These were not just signs of discomfort. They were warnings. Warnings that something inside had turned, that the body, once calm and controlled, was now rebelling. And the physician's job was to bring it back into order, to encourage the process. Additional methods were used: mustard plasters, vinegar compresses, heated stones pressed to the skin to draw blood to the surface. Once the blood flowed, it was collected in a basin, observed, and often described in detail: thick or thin, bright or dark, fast or slow. Each trait told the doctor something, or at least they believed it did. Sometimes the bloodletting worked, not because it cured the illness, but because the patient felt lighter, calmer. The pain eased temporarily. Other times it made things worse. Too much blood removed meant weakness, dizziness, fainting. But these effects were rarely blamed on the procedure. They were seen as necessary consequences, proof that the body had been corrected. And when blood was not enough, sweat became the next path to healing. The body, they believed, could release illness through pores, so women were wrapped in layers of cloth, placed near fires, and forced to sweat for hours. Herbs were burned nearby to assist. Basil, mint, rosemary. The air grew thick. The body is wet, and still they remained, waiting for the fever to break, for the balance to return. These sweat cures were uncomfortable, exhausting, and at times humiliating, but they were also private. carried out in bedrooms or side chambers, watched over by maids who had been taught how to comfort without questioning. A woman emerging from such treatment was often pale, weak, and more than a little resentful, but she powdered her face, perfumed her hands, and returned to court, as expected. The more elaborate the court, the more elaborate the cures. At Versailles, entire rooms were set aside for bleeding and sweating. Tapestries on the walls, cushions on the chairs, perfumed water in silver bowls. Everything was arranged to make the unpleasant seem elegant, to make illness appear manageable, even routine. But it was not routine for the women themselves. Each session was a reminder that their bodies were not their own. They belonged to a lineage, to expectation, to the performance of health, even in weakness. They didn't ask if the treatment was effective. They asked if it was necessary, and once the physician said yes, the rest followed. Some women believed deeply in these rituals. They fasted before treatment, prayed during, gave thanks afterward. Others endured them with clenched jaws and silent resentment. But regardless of belief, participation was not optional. A woman who refused treatment risked being labelled difficult, or worse, unstable. And so the lancet remained part of life. So did the fire. So did the herbs and the silence. There are letters from this time that speak of queens who bled monthly, not because of illness, but because it was recommended. As a form of maintenance, like brushing hair or trimming nails, the physician visited, the bowl was prepared, and another few ounces of blood joined the belief that health could be managed by subtraction. It is easy to forget, now, just how little was known about the body. There were no microscopes in those rooms, no understanding of bacteria or infection, only patterns, observations, and the belief that the body, if handled firmly, would comply. If it did not, the failure was moral, not medical. And if the Queen could endure it, so could everyone else. Her calm face during bloodletting was taken as a model. Her silence during the sweat cures was praised. No one spoke of the scars, or the side effects, or the quiet exhaustion that came with always being treated but never really healed, because treatment, like everything else in court, was performance. It had to look clean. It had to appear controlled. And if that meant draining blood under candlelight, with the scent of rosemary hanging in the air, then so be it. But behind those scented cloths and ceremonial tools, the body kept its truth. It weakened. It trembled. It grew tired of being balanced and restored. And still, it endured. Because queens did not get to fall apart. They were held together by habit, by duty, and by the belief that looking well mattered more than being well. And in the next part, we'll explore what happened when the performance extended beyond the living, when beauty standards followed royal women into death, and their bodies were prepared not for rest, but for display. There was no real end to the performance. Even in death, royal women were expected to look composed, clean, untouched. The moment breath left the body, another kind of preparation began, this time not for a banquet or a ball, but for something more permanent. The body would be seen, carried, watched by courtiers, ambassadors, and sometimes the public. And so, it had to be beautiful, or at least not alarming. Embalming was not new. In royal circles, it was a careful tradition. Not everyone agreed on how it should be done, but everyone agreed it had to be done. The process varied from country to country, and from one reign to the next, but the goal was always the same: preserve what remained, cover what changed, and never, ever let the scent of decay reach the velvet curtains. The first step was washing, which came as a strange irony. Many royal women had gone most of their lives avoiding soap and water. Now, in death, their bodies were finely washed, but not with ordinary soap. Instead, they were bathed in mixtures of herbs, oils, and wine. Lavender and rose were popular choices. Myrrh was used in some traditions. In wealthier courts, perfumed alcohol was poured carefully over the limbs, not just to cleanse, but to purify. After the washing came the packing. The body had to be dried, and that meant stuffing. Cavities were filled with sawdust, herbs, and sometimes fabric soaked in camphor. In France, doctors used aromatic paste made from spices and honey. In England, they sometimes used wax. The idea was not just preservation, it was control. No swelling, no sinking. Nothing reminded the viewer that this was no longer a living person. Cosmetics followed. Powder was applied to the face to smooth the skin tone. Rouge was brushed onto the cheeks. Lips were sometimes tinted. If the skin had darkened or bruised, it was covered with cloth or patches. Wigs were adjusted. Hands were arranged just so. And the eyes, if not sewn shut, were closed with care and pressed gently to create the look of calm. Clothing was chosen with purpose. It had to reflect dignity, status, and softness. Some queens were buried in state robes, others in simple white linen, but always with detail, embroidery, jewels, gloves, rings. The body was not just being buried, it was being seen, and every thread mattered. The coffin was often more elaborate than the bed the woman had slept in. Velvet lining, polished wood, silver trim. In some cases, it was open for days, set on display in a cold chapel, guarded by servants holding candles. People came to pay their respects. They bowed, they whispered, they studied the face for signs of peace or judgment. No one admitted to looking for the powder, but everyone knew it was there. Some queens had specific instructions for their post-mortem care, wills that described how they wanted to be dressed, what scents should be used, even who was allowed to touch them. These weren't vanity. They had a reputation. The final image mattered. For some, it mattered more than anything else. And beneath all the ritual was a quiet truth. These preparations were not only for the dead, they were for the living, to comfort them, to reassure them, to remind them that even in death, order remained, that the royal body, though lifeless, was still sacred, still perfect, still held together by the same rules it had followed in life. But not everything could be hidden. In warm weather, the embalming didn't always hold. There are accounts of queens whose bodies had to be rouged, whose lips had to be retouched before each viewing. One particularly unsettling record describes the smell creeping into the corners of a cathedral, forcing the guards to rotate every hour. Another tells of a veil being placed hastily across the face, midway through a procession. Still, no one said a word. They bowed, they walked, they held their breath and praised her grace. Because death, like everything else at court, had its script, and no one wanted to forget their lines. Behind the closed doors of preparation rooms, maids and apothecaries worked quietly. They adjusted the folds, they reapplied perfume, they replaced the wilting flowers on the chest. No applause waited for them, no recognition, but their work shaped the memory that would last. Sometimes, relics were taken. A lock of hair, a piece of lace, a glove. These items were treasured, kept in small boxes and passed down, not as reminders of love, always, but as proof of having been near, of having touched something important, something preserved. And when the funeral ended, and the body was finally lowered into the crypt, the scent remained, in the room, in the clothes of the attendants, on the pages of letters written that week. It lingered longer than expected, as if to say that beauty, once applied, did not give up easily. Even centuries later, when royal tombs are opened for study, traces of these rituals are found. Bits of fabric still hold the smell of cloves, hair still carries wax, rings are still set on fingers that were arranged with care, and the face, even if sunken, still shows the remnants of rouge pressed on long ago. It is strange, perhaps, to think of a queen being powdered after death, to imagine her cheeks being tinted by a maid with trembling hands. but in the logic of court life, it made perfect sense. The body was never just a body, it was a symbol, a vessel, a mirror of power. So the rituals continued, not out of superstition, not out of fear, but out of habit, out of loyalty, and maybe, just maybe, out of affection. In the next part, we will return to the realm of the living, where rituals were still part of daily life, and where privacy, for a royal woman, was often just a curtain and a prayer. Privacy was a rare thing for royal women. Almost everything they did was observed, commented on, and carefully recorded. From the way they entered a room to the way they sat at dinner, every movement carried meaning. But when it came to personal hygiene, that same attention became a burden, because even the most basic bodily functions had to be carried out under the watchful eye of the court, and behind the curtain, so to speak, there was very little space to breathe. The royal bedchamber was never truly private. It was a stage set with fine linens, glowing candles, and a line of waiting servants. Each woman had a routine, and each routine required help. Getting dressed, getting undressed, preparing for sleep, even washing. When it happened, it was a group effort. The queen did not fetch her water, she didn't carry her towel, and when she was finished, she did not clean the basin. For most royal women, the best they could hope for was a folding screen. Something tall enough to block part of the view, but not so wide that it disrupted the room. Behind it, they could bathe, or more often, dab themselves with scented cloths. These clothes were prepared in advance, soaked in floral waters or diluted vinegar. They were warm when used, sometimes scented with rose, sometimes with lavender. The act was not vigorous, it was delicate, a kind of slow-motion wipe, enough to remove surface dirt, not enough to disturb what lay underneath. The clothes were not washed after every use. That would have been wasteful. Instead, they were aired, draped over chairs or window frames, left out for the breeze to do its work, then folded and returned to the table by the next morning. Servants understood this rhythm. They knew what to do and when to do it, and most of the time, they said nothing. Silence was expected. Silence was professional. Even so, mistakes happened. A servant entered too soon. A maid dropped the wrong clothes. A screen shifted. In those moments, everyone froze. The air grew thick, and then, just as quickly, the performance resumed. A quiet apology, a glance away, a distraction offered, perhaps a change of subject, because dignity had to be preserved, even if only in fragments. The real challenge came during travel. Moving from palace to palace meant adjusting to new rooms, new staff, and often worse conditions. Privacy disappeared almost completely. Royal carriages were not comfortable. They were cramped, loud, and slow. Stops were infrequent. When nature called, the options were limited. A lady in waiting would hold a cloth, another would shield with a fan. The chamber pot might be tucked under the seat. No one spoke. No one made eye contact. The queen would emerge composed. The pot would disappear. Life went on. In larger palaces, some efforts were made to provide personal space. Alcoves, side rooms, even enclosed closets. But these were used by many, and they were not always clean. The smell lingered. The stone floors stayed cold, and the water, when it came, was never quite warm enough. So many women avoided the process altogether. Better to perfume than to risk a cold. Better to layer another petticoat than to remove the one already worn. Undergarments were considered part of the solution. Made of linen, they were believed to absorb sweat and protect the outer layers. They were worn for days, sometimes weeks, without washing. When removed, they were aired, not scrubbed. Stains were brushed. Spots were treated with herbs. Only in the worst cases were they soaked, and even then, with care. No boiling, no harsh soap, just patience and sun. The belief was that natural fibres, if left in the open air, would purify themselves. So the windows were kept open. Clothes hung beside them. Scented satchels were tucked inside sleeves and bodices. Lavender was common. Rosemary. Sometimes lemon peel. It helped, but not enough. The odour of lived-in garments lingered. And no curtain could block that completely. For those who could afford it, new garments were always being made. A chemise for travel, another for feast days, another for mourning. But not everyone replaced things often. Some women grew attached to familiar pieces. They adjusted hems, patched seams, and added lace to hidewear. The illusion of newness was maintained, even when the fabric had long since lost its shine. And through it all, the servants remained present, holding out towels, brushing wrinkles, lighting the fire, preparing the scented cloths without comment. Their presence was constant. Their hands are steady, their eyes lowered. They were part of the room, but not the story. Until something went wrong. A fainting spell, a dropped basin, a reaction to perfume. In those moments, the illusion cracked and the reality of being human reappeared. Quickly, someone stepped forward. A maid caught the fall. Another whispered instructions. A third offered a cloth. Within minutes, the court resumed. The curtain reset. The Queen smiled, and all was forgotten. It is easy to imagine these women as pampered, surrounded by help, free from labour. But the truth was more complicated. To live without privacy is to live without pause. Every gesture is measured, every movement rehearsed. There was no room to be tired, no space to be unwell. Only the routine, and the hope that no one noticed when it slipped. Even letters from the period show how rare solitude was. Queens wrote of longing for quiet, for space, for time alone. Some retreated to gardens, others to prayer, but the world followed. The expectations never stopped, and the curtain, no matter how heavy, could not block everything. So they learned to live with it, to embrace the curtain as both shield and stage, to make the rituals look elegant, to hide discomfort with grace, and to count each moment of stillness as rare. In the next part, we will explore how royal women dressed not just for fashion, but for function, how every layer, every lace, and every clasp served a purpose, not always a comfortable one, but always deliberate. Dressing was never simple. For royal women, putting on clothes was closer to an architectural process than a casual act. It required layers, planning, and assistance. Every piece had its reason. Some layers held shape, others absorbed sweat. A few were purely decorative, but even those played their part in keeping up appearances. Comfort, as usual, was not the point. The goal was control of the body, of the image, of what could be seen and what had to be hidden. The first layer was usually linen, a chemise or smock, soft enough to touch the skin, but sturdy enough to hold up through repeated wear. This layer caught most of the sweat and body oils. It was the garment least likely to be washed often, yet closest to the skin. Over time, the fabric yellowed. It softened. It shaped itself to the body it served. Some women had dozens. Others relied on a few favourites, but all of them treated this layer as essential, even if it rarely showed. Next came the stays or corset. Boned with whalebone or stiffened with reeds, this piece pressed the body into an acceptable shape, not just a smaller waist, but a straighter posture, lifted chest, and rigid silhouette. Wearing it was not optional. It marked the difference between private and presentable, between waking and being seen. Tying it required help. Tightening it took strength. Loosening it, even briefly, was considered indulgent. Most women wore it from morning until night. After the corset came the petticoats, sometimes one, often two or three. They added volume, they smoothed lines, they helped keep outer garments from clinging too closely. In cold weather, they were insulated. In warm weather, they trapped heat. Still, they were worn, because without them, the gown would not fall correctly. The weight was part of the look. The gown itself varied by time and country. Some are laced in the front, others buttoned in the back. Sleeves were often separate, tied on with ribbons or sewn into place. The fabric could be velvet, brocade, silk, or wool, lighter materials for spring, heavier ones for winter, but all thick, all rich, all are difficult to wash, which meant they were rarely cleaned and frequently perfumed. Each outfit was chosen with care. Colour mattered, cut mattered, embellishments mattered. A dress with pearls stitched into the seams said something. So did a pattern of gold thread. So did the number of buttons, the placement of lace, and the length of the train. Nothing was accidental. Even mourning clothes, meant to be simple, followed strict codes. Black for a queen, grey for a cousin, purple for a child. Each thread had rules. Accessories completed the outfit. Gloves, sometimes perfumed, a fan, always close at hand, a small pouch for herbs or charms, jewellery, of course, played a role, necklaces, earrings, brooches, not just for beauty, but for signalling status. A borrowed sapphire might cause gossip, a missing brooch might raise questions. Everything worn was noticed, everything mattered, hair had its routine, often pinned up, often covered. Wigs were common, especially when the natural hair had thinned or been damaged by powder and pomade. Some wigs were simple, others were towering structures of curls, braids, and ornaments. They required maintenance, they attracted insects. They had to be stored carefully, combed gently, and sometimes replaced entirely, but they were worn, because they finished the picture. Shoes were rarely seen, but always worn. Silk slippers, leather boots, embroidered flats, not always practical, not always comfortable, but always part of the uniform. Stockings were held with garters, layers beneath layers, nothing left to chance. All of this took time. Dressing could last an hour or more, and that was with assistance. A lady in waiting held the sleeves, another adjusted the corset, a third fetched the jewels. The queen stood, or sometimes sat, while the process unfolded around her. Talking was limited, movements were minimal, everyone knew their task. Once dressed, the woman was expected to stay that way. No casual changes, no resting in half-dress, unless illness prevented it. She remained in full attire until the day was done, which meant sitting stiffly, walking carefully, eating cautiously. Every gesture is shaped by the clothes themselves, and underneath it all, the body responded. It sweated, it swelled, it itched, but there was little to be done. Scratching was rude, adjusting was awkward, so discomfort became normal. Pressure became familiar. The weight of the gown, the tightness of the stays, the heat of the layers, it was all part of the role. Some women endured it better than others. Some grew faint, others developed rashes, still others took to fainting, not from nerves, but from circulation. Yet they continued, because undressing was even more complicated, and because appearances, once established, had to be maintained. When evening came, the process reversed. Jewels were removed, laces untied, pins are collected in bowls, gowns lifted over heads or stepped out of with care. The underlayers, damp with the day's effort, were aired, sometimes wiped, rarely washed. Bodies were powdered again, linens adjusted, nightgowns slipped on, and the next day it all began again. It might sound excessive, and in many ways it was, but to the women living it, this was normal, this was expected. Dressing was not just about covering the body, it was about shaping the person, announcing status, hiding flaws, projecting control. Even a queen who ruled a kingdom had to bow to fashion. She had to wear what tradition demanded. She had to sweat under brocade while pretending she did not notice. She had to walk in tight shoes, speak through a corset, and smile beneath a powdered wig, all without complaint, because to complain was to invite scrutiny, and scrutiny, in the court, was always dangerous. In the next part, we will look more closely at those wigs, how they were made, how they were maintained, and what happened when things living found their way inside them. The wig, for many royal women, was more than just a solution. It was a statement, a way to control their image, even when the body beneath it began to betray them. Thinning hair, uneven growth, bald patches from tight lacing, or skin infections could all be hidden beneath layers of curls and volume. And once wigs became part of the court wardrobe, they were not just expected, they were essential. Most wigs were made from human hair, some came from donors, others were purchased or collected through less transparent means. In some cases, entire villages were known to shave their heads in exchange for coin. The collected hair was sorted by colour, texture, and length. Blonde hair was prized. Red was fashionable in some courts. Black was rarer. The strands were washed, dried, and sewn into a mesh base, sometimes stiffened with wax, sometimes layered over wire for structure. A finished wig could take weeks to build and hours to style. Once completed, the wig had to be maintained. It was brushed, powdered, and perfumed. Hair powder was a mixture of starch, flour, and scented oils. Applied by hand or with a brush, it created a soft, pale coating that gave the wig its signature look. But powder was not kind to the scalp. It clogged pores, it irritated the skin, it clung to the air, settled on clothing, and left behind a scent that mixed flowers with flour and something else no one named. Still, women wore them proudly. Some wigs were modest, others reached absurd heights, woven with ribbons, pearls, and even small figurines. One trend featured tiny ships riding crests of hair, complete with sails and masts. Another included miniature gardens with silk flowers and artificial birds. It was fashion as theatre, but it was also heavy. A fully dressed wig could weigh several pounds. Wearing it required posture. Wearing it all day required patience. Underneath the wig, the head did not always fare well. The real hair was braided tightly or shaved. The scalp was rarely cleaned. Sweat collected. Powder drifted down and settled against the skin. Over time, this created perfect conditions for lice and mites. Some women scratched constantly, others applied more powder. A few ignored the problem entirely until it became visible. Then the wig was burned, and a new one was ordered. Cleaning a wig was not simple. Washing it was risky. Water melted the animal fat used for styling. Heat damaged the structure. Moisture invited mildew. So instead of washing, most wigs were refreshed, combed, dusted, repowdered. If perfume faded, more was added. If the curls lost shape, pins were added. If all else failed, it was replaced. Some women had entire wardrobes of wigs, one for the court, one for walks, one for mourning, one for portraits. Each one was labelled, stored on padded stands, and rotated with care. Servants were trained to handle them delicately, to adjust placement, to tighten straps, to brush out tangles without pulling too hard. It was an art form, and a daily performance. Of course, not everyone had the same access. Some women wore wigs, others reused old ones from older relatives. These tended to have more problems. They shed, they shifted, they held on to smell, but they were still worn. Because to be seen without a wig was unthinkable. It meant vulnerability, it meant exposure, and for royal women, those were not options. There are records of women fainting under the weight. Others had headaches that never quite left. But they powdered their faces, fastened their earrings, and lifted their chins. Because the wig was not just about beauty, it was about expectation, about fitting into a space where everything had to look controlled. Even discomfort had to wear a bow. Lice, when discovered, became a shared concern, not just for the wearer, but for everyone near. Special combs were used, scented powders were applied, linen caps were worn at night. In some courts, entire mornings were dedicated to inspecting wigs for signs of trouble. If the infestation was bad, the solution was simple: throw it in the fire. There is one record from a Spanish court where a queen's favourite wig began to move during a banquet. Tiny insects had gathered along the seam, escaping one by one as the night wore on. She kept her face still, nodded politely, and finished the meal. The wig was removed after midnight and destroyed. No one mentioned it again. That, too, was part of the performance. Even so, the reality was known. Behind the polished mirrors and gold trim, every woman knew what might be hiding just above her forehead. The discomfort, the heat, the itch, and yet they carried on. Because to remove the wig was to remove the image, and that was not allowed. Hair loss became more common as women aged, some from illness, some from repeated tension, others from the ingredients in their makeup and perfumes. But a full head of styled hair remained the standard, so wigs grew thicker, taller, more elaborate, covering more, saying less. Today, wigs are used by choice, for style, for fun, for fashion. But in those courts, they were closer to armour, built to protect what was fragile, to hide what time had taken, to keep the illusion in place, and like all parts of royal hygiene, they were maintained with discipline, with tools, with scent, with silence. In the next part, we will shift focus from what was worn to what was underneath. Not the skin, but the air, the heat, the sweating that happened behind the brocade and under the pearls. Because staying dry was not always possible, and pretending to be comfortable became a daily act. Beneath all the layers, under the corset, behind the powder and the wig, the body did what bodies do. It warmed, it shifted, it sweated, and in the closed spaces of royal life, with heavy fabrics, candlelight, and limited ventilation, sweat was more than a private inconvenience. It was a constant challenge, one that royal women had to manage without showing it existed. Sweating was not seen as normal, not for noble women. It was associated with labour, with farmers and servants, with people who worked under the sun and had no choice. A lady glistening at a feast or dabbing her neck during a ceremony was, in theory, unimaginable. But reality was less cooperative. Courts were crowded, ballrooms filled quickly, churches were warm and solemn, gowns were heavy, corsets tight, and the air stayed still. Most palaces had no cooling systems. Large windows helped, but not much. Tapestries hung on walls to preserve heat. Thick rugs covered stone floors. Fires burned year-round in drafty corners. In summer, the heat built slowly, rising in rooms filled with guests and smoke. In winter, it trapped itself inside fur and wool. Either way, the result was the same: sweat. But admitting to it was another matter. Women carried scented cloths to blot their skin. Fans were used constantly, fluttering not just for style but for survival. Some carried dried herbs in their gloves or stitched small bundles of rosemary into the seams of their bodices. The idea was to catch the moisture, block the odour, and maintain the image. Corsets made it worse. They pressed against the skin, trapping heat. They left no room for air to circulate. The boning cut into the ribs, held posture firm, and made deep breathing a challenge. Underneath, linen shifts soaked through, clinging to the back and chest. But no one spoke of this. Women stood, smiled, and pretended, always pretending. At court functions, movement was limited, walking slowly, sitting for long hours, standing in place during ceremonies that lasted into the night, all in full dress, all under observation. If a woman grew flushed, someone handed her a fan. If her hand trembled, someone offered water, but sweating openly would have been considered crude. So they endured, quietly. Servants knew what to watch for. They saw the damp edges of lace, the reddened cheeks, the sleeves adjusted too frequently. They prepared clothes in advance. Cool water scented with mint, cloth folded twice for discretion. The Queen might excuse herself to a private alcove, dab at her collarbone, reapply powder, and return. But the discomfort did not leave. It simply followed her back into the room. Some women developed tricks, powdering between layers, changing linen midday, using vinegar washes to cool the skin before dressing. Others soaked herbs in wine and pressed the liquid into their underarms. A few burned herbs in small bowls beneath their dressing tables, hoping the scent would cling to their bodies. These solutions helped, but only slightly. In some cases, sweat was treated as an illness. If it became excessive, physicians were called. Diagnoses range from overheating of the blood to spiritual imbalance. Treatments included more layers, more herbs, sometimes even bleeding, to release the hot humours. None of it addressed the simple fact that the body, wrapped in too much cloth, under too much pressure, would sweat. The problem extended to the bedding. Feather mattresses are soaked in summer. Linen sheets yellowed with time. Blankets trapped the heat of the day. Washing these items was rare. More often, they were aired out, draped over railings or windows, scented with herbs, sprinkled with powder. But the smell of stale sweat did not fade easily. It lingered, especially in the private rooms. Behind the public spaces, the illusion dropped slightly. The air grew thicker. Some queens had their methods. Elizabeth of Austria, for example, kept her rooms as cool as possible. She demanded fresh linens daily. She exercised early in the morning and powdered heavily before appearing. Others ordered scented braziers to burn in corners. The smoke masked more than it helped, but it gave the illusion of freshness. Of course, none of this addressed the skin itself. Chafing was common. Rashes appeared in summer. Fungal infections were quietly treated with salves. Maids knew how to mix pastes, how to fold cloth to avoid friction, how to soothe without drawing attention. No one spoke of it, but everyone knew. Even the chairs at court reflected this reality. Padded seats, covered in brocade, held on to warmth. After hours of sitting, they were damp. Servants were quick to rotate cushions, to spray them with floral water, to pretend they had not been soaked. But the truth was hard to ignore. One ambassador visiting a summer feast in France wrote of the air being thick enough to chew. He praised the gowns, the music, and the decor. But at the end, he added a single line. He had never seen so many women fan themselves with such urgency. That was as close to honesty as his letter allowed. And still, the women smiled. They walked in gowns lined with damp linen. They held hands laced with powder. They danced until dawn, skin raw under layers. Because that was what was expected. Grace without effort, beauty without sweat, even when it was impossible. Today, we speak of self-care, of breathable fabrics, of comfort and health. But in those courts, comfort was considered weakness. Sweat was a failure. The body, if managed correctly, was supposed to stay quiet, dry, controlled. So they layered, powdered, perfumed, and endured. They smiled through damp cuffs. They nodded with flushed cheeks. They learned to ignore the smell, or to call it something else. In the next part, we will look closer at what they wore underneath it all, the garments that touched the skin, that bore the burden of the body, and that were, more often than not, never truly cleaned. The garments that sat closest to the skin had one job. They were meant to protect the outer layers, to absorb sweat, to collect the dust, oil, and everything else a royal woman's body produced over long hours in tight clothing. These were the underclothes, plain linen shifts, petticoats, drawers when they were worn, and bodices lined with cotton or wool. They formed the quiet foundation of the grand performance, and they were rarely properly cleaned. Unlike the velvet and brocade that drew attention, These pieces were not for display. They were rarely seen, tucked beneath corsets and silk. They existed to carry the weight of the day. A linen chemise might be worn from morning until night, absorbing everything that corset and gown refused to touch. Afterward, it would be hung in the open air, not washed, not scrubbed, just aired. The logic was simple. Water, when used too often, was believed to damage the fabric. Soap was considered harsh. The sun and breeze, on the other hand, were trusted allies. Maids would take the garments to a window, or if possible, to a quiet courtyard. They would shake them out gently, sprinkle them with floral water, and hang them until dry. Then they would fold the clothes neatly and return them to their place, ready for the next day. Washing happened, but not often. It required time, fuel, heat, space to dry, and it came with risk. Boiling could shrink the fabric. Scrubbing could wear it thin. So, royal households developed a threshold. A visible stain might qualify. So might an odour that drifted too far. But most of the time, underclothes were rotated, not laundered. One chemise in use, another airing. A third is saved for special days, and a fourth is waiting for repairs. Repairs were common. Seams tore, edges frayed, sweat stained the underarms and the small of the back. The maids stitched where needed. Patches were added. Discoloration was covered with embroidery. Lace trim could disguise wear. A clever servant could extend the life of a single undergarment for years, especially if no one ever saw it closely. Some queens had preferences. Elizabeth Rice favoured fine linen. She required it to be changed often, at least more than most. But even then, the change did not always mean cleaning. A shift might move from the body to the air, then back again, folded, smoothed, freshened with lavender, but never touched by hot water. There were beliefs behind this. Some thought that linen, being a natural fibre, cleansed itself with air. Others believed that frequent washing weakened the cloth's ability to protect, and still others simply accepted the rhythm because it had always been so. Their mothers had done it, their grandmothers too, and so the pattern continued. These garments were not light, especially when layered. Some shifts had long sleeves, some had fitted collars. They rubbed at the neck, they gathered at the waist. In summer, they clung to the skin. In winter, they trapped dampness under wool, and yet they stayed on, all day, under everything else, only removed at night, if the woman was lucky enough to sleep alone. At night, the shift was sometimes exchanged for a nightgown, but not always. Some women slept in the same linen they had worn during the day, especially when travelling, especially when ill, especially when dressing again in the morning was too much trouble. The cloth grew warm, then stale, then sour, but it remained, because habits, once established, were hard to break. There is a kind of quiet absurdity in all of this. A queen might wear a gown trimmed in gold, a necklace of pearls, shoes stitched by hand, but beneath it all, she wore a shift that had not seen soap in weeks, and no one mentioned it, no one dared, as long as the scent stayed within the folds, and the cloth did not show at the edges. The illusion held. Servants bore the real cost. They handled the garments, folded them, carried them, smelled them. They learned to hold the cloth at a distance, to press the scented herbs with extra care, to praise the embroidery instead of noticing the stain. Their job was not just to clean, it was to protect the illusion, and themselves. Even today, a few pieces of these undergarments survive, stored in museums, studied by historians. They show wear, they show staining, they tell the quiet truth of royal life, that no matter how many layers were added, the skin underneath behaved the same, and the cloth closest to it told that story better than any portrait ever could. Some garments were kept after death, stored with care, labelled and boxed, not because they were beautiful, but because they had touched the body. They became relics of routine, symbols of daily life, not jewels, not crowns, but folded linen with a history of its own. It is easy to forget how intimate these layers were, how closely they held the body, how silently they did their work. They bore the weight of sweat, of scent, of pressure. They took on the discomfort that gowns tried to hide, and they asked for nothing in return, only a little air, a little patience, a little space to rest. But even these quiet layers were not safe from scrutiny. If a chemise peeked out from under a gown, it had to be clean. If the lace at the collar turned yellow, it had to be replaced. Appearance mattered, even in the smallest threads. And in the next part, we will follow one of the most awkward aspects of royal hygiene, the one that could not be perfumed, stitched, or powdered, the one that came once a month, quietly, uninvited, and full of inconvenience. There was one visitor that no queen could ignore. It arrived monthly, stayed uninvited, and brought with it a level of discomfort that even the finest lace could not conceal. Menstruation was not a topic for court conversation, not even whispered among ladies unless truly necessary. Yet it was as real as the crown, and royal women, despite their status, had to face it with limited tools, little privacy, and a great deal of silence. In the early modern period, menstrual care was a mix of folklore, makeshift solutions, and trial by discomfort. There were no commercial products, no soft cotton pads, no elastic bands, or discreet packaging. Instead, women used cloth rags, often linen, folded into thick layers. These clothes were held in place by strings or ties, if at all. Sometimes they were simply wedged into place, relying on the weight of skirts and the stiffness of corsets to keep everything where it needed to be. These rags had a name. They were often called monthly clothes. They were washed and reused, though rarely with any real efficiency. The washing process was awkward. Water had to be heated. Soap was harsh and expensive. Blood left stains that never fully disappeared. So most of the time, the clothes were rinsed, wrung out, and hung discreetly behind shutters or in the servants' areas, away from noble eyes. And yet, everyone knew. The maids handled the clothes. They noticed when their lady needed help walking or sat with more caution. They noticed that when a fresh set of sheets was requested more than once in a week. They noticed the signs, even if nothing was said aloud. The entire system ran on silent cooperation. The discomfort was constant. Even the best clothes shifted out of place. They rubbed against the skin. They trapped heat and moisture, irritating. Infection was a common risk, though never discussed as such. If a woman developed a rash or fever, it might be blamed on bad air or spoiled food. Rarely did anyone connect it back to the same cloth being used over and over again, with only a rinse in between. There were other methods, though not all reliable. Some women used wool, or even soft moss, packed into linen. Others tried sponges soaked in wine or vinegar, hoping for cleanliness, or at least to mask the smell. A few records mention women sitting over herbs or ashes, hoping the heat and smoke would cleanse the body. Most of these solutions caused more problems than they solved. Privacy was scarce. Even queens shared rooms. Servants entered frequently. There was no lock on the door, no time alone to manage pain or discomfort. When cramps arrived, there were no pills, no hot water bottles. Some women pressed warmed bricks to their stomachs. Others drank herbal teas or took to bed. But the rest was a luxury. Life at court did not pause for blood. Staining was the greatest fear. A red mark on a gown, a seat cushion, or a bedsheet could damage a reputation. It was seen as a failure, as carelessness, as something indecent. So women took great pains to hide any trace. They wore extra layers. They folded the cloth 3 or 4 times. They sat on folded shawls. Some even sewed dark patches into the underside of their skirts to mask the inevitable. And yet, accidents happened. Servants knew how to spot them and remove evidence quickly. A stained seat would be turned over. A gown would be rushed to the mending room. a lady might disappear for an hour, only to return in a different dress, powdered and silent, no explanation given, none required. There was shame attached to this cycle, even though it was natural. It reminded everyone that the female body did not always behave politely, that it had needs, that it could not be fully controlled by manners or lace. So it was tucked away, hidden under perfume and silence, managed behind curtains and within tight schedules. Even physicians were unsure what to say. Some claimed that menstrual blood was dangerous, it carried poisons, that women were unclean during their cycle. Others believed it was a form of balance, a way to release excess heat. Neither view led to helpful solutions, and neither gave women comfort. Instead, the burden remained personal. Pain was endured with gritted teeth, stains were scrubbed away in corners, linen was folded tightly and stored out of sight. When the cycle ended, there was a brief sense of relief, not joy, just quiet gratitude that the worst had passed. Until next time. It is tempting now to look back with disbelief, to wonder how women endured, but they did, because there was no other option. They made their systems, they trained their daughters and their maids, they passed down tricks, even if none of them truly worked, and they did all of this while smiling, dancing, sitting in court for hours, pretending that nothing was out of the ordinary. Men knew, of course. Some turned their heads. Others made jokes in private, but most simply looked the other way, pretending that their queen did not bleed, that their duchess never stained a cushion, that women were somehow clean by nature. It was easier that way. It kept the illusion alive. The truth, however, remained beneath the layers, in the folded cloths, the hidden stains, the winces behind the fan. Royal life was not clean. It was managed, carefully, desperately, sometimes painfully. And in the next part, we turn to the one place where everyone hoped to find relief, but often found something else entirely: the royal toilet. For a palace so large, so full of whispers and gowns and gold, one might expect the royal toilet to be an escape, a sanctuary of sorts, a private moment in a life that rarely allows any. But in truth, it was not a place of comfort, not even close. The royal toilet, in all its variations, was more symbolic than sanitary. It represented order, rank, and routine, but rarely relief. Most palaces had what they called garderobes. These were small stone chambers built into the thick outer walls, with a narrow seat cut from wood or stone. The waist dropped down a vertical shaft, sometimes into a moat, sometimes onto open ground below. There was no flushing, no cleaning system, and no barrier, just a hole and gravity. In winter, the seat was cold enough to burn. In summer, the smell rose back up the shaft with a confidence that no perfume could defeat. Royal women did not always use these directly. In the most formal courts, like that of Elizabeth the Fair, a special role existed. It was called the Mistress of the Robes, or, more intimately, the Lady of the Bedchamber. Among their many tasks, one included managing the Queen's toilet arrangements. It was considered an honour, a close, trusted position, but the job itself was anything but glamorous. Portable chamber pots were often used instead. They were made of pewter, brass, or porcelain if one had the luxury. These pots were brought into the bedchamber, sometimes hidden behind a screen, sometimes not. A maid would help remove the layers of clothing. She would hold them back, keep them from dragging or tipping the pot. There was no privacy, only procedure. After use, the pot was covered and carried away, where it depended on the palace. Some had a dumping chamber. Others simply instructed servants to pour the contents into a garden, into the river, or into the corner designated for waste. The pot was rinsed, not always thoroughly, and returned to its place. There were smells. Of course, there were. The pot could be scented with herbs, rosemary, lavender, and mint, but it rarely helped. The scent of decay and body waste was too strong. It clung to the air, to the stone walls, to the skirts of those who passed too near. There was no ventilation, just a window, if you were lucky, often too small to matter. And then there was the matter of frequency. A woman might use the pot multiple times a day, especially during illness, especially when pregnant. But each time required assistance, required timing, required coordination with her ladies. If someone was late, or distracted, or ill themselves, the whole process slowed, and discomfort grew. Even more awkward were the formal events, balls, banquets, and public appearances. A royal gown could take half an hour to remove. It was not designed for urgency. So many women avoided drinking too much. They trained their bodies. They hoped the need would not come until after the event. If it did, they endured, quietly, carefully. Some found tricks. They used footstools for balance. They lifted only the necessary layers. They whispered to their maid before the signal was even needed. But none of it made the process less humiliating, just more predictable. In France, it was said that courtiers sometimes relieved themselves behind curtains during long receptions. The floor was covered in rushes, which absorbed more than just spilled wine. Whether or not this was true for the English court is debated, but the principle remains. There were a few good options. Cleanliness was always relative. The chamber pots were reused. The garderobes were rarely emptied. Flies were common, so were stains on the stone floors. The air was heavy, always. Perfume was sprayed. Herbs were crushed. Doors were kept closed. But the truth never stayed hidden for long. The Queen herself had little say in this. She followed the routine set by generations before her. She trusted her ladies. She held her breath. She sat, or knelt, or stood, depending on the design, and she said nothing, because dignity was not about smell, it was about silence. Some guests were shocked. Foreign ambassadors noted the lack of hygiene. They wrote letters home describing the stench, the strange rituals, the open waste pits. But in court, they bowed, they smiled, they breathed through their silk gloves. The irony was rich. The richest people in the country had the poorest plumbing. Their gowns were stitched with gold, but they squatted over pots like peasants. Their halls echoed with music, but also with the scrape of buckets and the clatter of chamber lids. Still, no one complained, not aloud. The court moved forward, buckets were emptied, stone floors were scrubbed with vinegar, chamber pots were hidden behind curtains, and everyone agreed to pretend that everything smelled just fine. Today, we look back and marvel at the gowns, the jewels, the painted ceilings. We forget the chamber pots, the cold stone seats, the quiet, desperate dance of bodily need. But it was there, always, behind every curtain, beneath every throne. And in the next part, we turn to the mouth, the royal smile, the teeth that gleamed in portraits but told a very different story in person. Royal portraits often show perfect faces, smooth skin, rosy cheeks, a serene expression that hints at wisdom and restraint, and somewhere near the bottom of the painting, a subtle smile, a mouth that seems calm, almost gentle. But the truth behind that smile was rarely pleasant. Royal teeth were not quite the pearly white marvels those paintings suggested. They were often the exact opposite. Let's begin with the basics. Dental hygiene in the early modern period was more guesswork than science. Toothbrushes, if they existed at all, were not the soft bristled tools we know today. Some women used frayed twigs, gently chewed at one end until they formed a sort of brush. Others wrapped linen around a finger, dipped it in wine or vinegar, and rubbed it across the teeth. It was better than nothing, but only slightly. Tooth powder was available in certain circles, made from crushed herbs, burnt bread, salt, or even ground bones. It promised freshness and polish. In practice, it scraped at the enamel and left gums bleeding. Royal women used it because they had to appear composed, but each application hurt a little. Over time, it did more harm than good. Then came the diet, high in sugar, especially for the wealthy. Sugar imported from abroad was a prized luxury, and the royal court had plenty. Candied fruits, spiced wine, sweetened meat sauces. Even medicines were mixed with sugar. And as sugar consumption rose, so did tooth decay, slowly, quietly, until one day the pain arrived. Toothaches were common, cavities were untreated, gums swelled, breath soured, but no one said a word. A queen could not grimace. A duchess could not excuse herself mid-banquet to lie down in agony. Instead, they took herbs, chewed on cloves, pressed cold rags to their faces, or simply endured. If a tooth had to be pulled, it was done quickly, without warning, without anything resembling anesthesia. An iron tool was inserted, twisted, and yanked. The crack echoed. The blood followed. The screams were stifled, and afterward the queen still had to smile. Maybe with lips closed, maybe with one side turned slightly away from the crowd. There were false teeth, too, made from bone or ivory, or borrowed, quite literally, from the mouths of the poor. Dentures were carved, wired together, and shoved into place. They didn't fit well. They caused ulcers. They shifted when speaking. But they looked better than an empty smile. And in portraits, that was all that mattered. The mouth was a battlefield, not only because of decay, but also because of infection. Abscesses formed, jaws swelled. Sometimes the pain spreads to the ear or the eye. Doctors applied leeches, or lanced the gum with a hot needle. These were the best solutions available. Despite all this, the court still valued appearance. A good smile was part of the power, so the royal women powdered their lips. They dabbed perfume along the jawline. They turned their heads in portraits to hide the worst side, and they trained themselves to speak without moving their mouths too much. You could tell a lot from a smile at court. Who had suffered, who had money for clove oil, who had learned to live with the rot, who had given up on hiding it, and who had mastered the art of pretending everything was fine. Guests noticed. They wrote about blackened teeth, about strange smiles, about a strange contrast between painted perfection and real discomfort. But they did not speak of it in public. That would be rude. That would risk everything. So the smiles continued, carefully managed, painted on, a mix of grace and decay. It's worth remembering that Queen Elizabeth herself had famously bad teeth in her later years. Her love for sweets was well known, her breath less so, but much discussed by foreign visitors. She wore layers of makeup to distract from her mouth. She spoke softly, and when she smiled, she did so with precision. The court followed her example. Teeth were not to be discussed, only whitened or hidden or ignored, even if they hurt, even if they bled. Today, dental care is routine. We floss, we rinse, we visit dentists with warm lights and reclining chairs. But back then, each bite of sugar was a risk. Each smile is a performance. Each toothache is a reminder that power did not protect you from pain. The royal mouth was a quiet tragedy, covered in paint, tucked behind lace fans, whispered about but never addressed, and still the portrait smiled on. In the next part, we'll move from the mouth to the crown, not the golden one, but the scalp underneath, because what lived in royal hair was not always hair alone. The crown may have glittered with rubies and pearls, but underneath it, the scalp told a very different story. Beneath the carefully pinned hair, under the veils and the elaborate headpieces, was a place that most people in court would rather not think about, a place that was hidden from view, but very much alive. Because royal hair was not just a symbol of beauty, it was a quiet battleground, and it had tenants. Lice were everywhere. They were not a mark of poverty or poor breeding, or they were universal. Even queens scratched their scalps behind closed doors. Even duchesses asked their maids to search through the strands. There was no shame in it, only silence. It was part of life. part of wearing heavy wigs, rarely washing, and sleeping in the same position night after night. The hair was rarely cut. That was a symbol of status. Long hair meant you were not a labourer. It meant you had time, help, and mirrors. But long hair also meant tangles. It meant days of build-up. It meant the perfect hiding place for pests. So women combed and combed, every morning, every night. With fine-toothed combs made from ivory or horn, they went through each section, sometimes for hours. These combs were not just for styling, they were weapons, meant to catch eggs, pull lice, and scratch at the irritated scalp. It was a painful ritual, but a necessary one. Some women rubbed vinegar into the roots, others crushed herbs and oils into a paste. They believed rosemary might scare the lice, that lavender would soothe the itch. Sometimes it worked, often it didn't. Wigs complicated everything. Wigs were fashionable. They covered grey hairs. They created volume. They were styled into impossible shapes that no real hair could manage. But wigs were also warm and dark and rarely cleaned. They were a paradise for lice, a portable nest. Once a wig was infested, it had to be boiled or burned. Few were willing to do either. Most simply powdered it, perfumed it, and hoped for the best. Underneath the wigs, the real hair suffered. The scalp was raw, the roots were weak, the smell was musty. The maids applied more powder, more oil, anything to disguise what lingered. But the weight of the wig pressed down. The itch returned. The cycle continued. Head coverings made things worse. They were made of velvet, silk, and fur. They held in the heat. They trapped sweat. They were worn indoors and outdoors. They were rarely aired out. When removed at night, they left marks on the forehead and a line of dampness across the back of the neck. The next morning, they went right back on. Royal women often slept with their hair braided tightly, to avoid tangles, to preserve the wave. But the tightness pulled at the scalp, caused sores, created perfect folds for lice to lay eggs. When these women woke up, they reached for the comb. Again. Servants bore the brunt of it. They washed the clothes. They picked through the hair. They swept up the powder and the fallen strands. Some wore gloves. Most did not. It was an intimate job, and an endless one. You could never truly get ahead of the lice, only chase them. Every day, portraits lied, as they always did. The hair in paintings was flawless. Each strand is smooth, each curl obedient. No sign of flaking, no sign of redness, no sign of the tiny creatures that made life miserable. That was not the image anyone wanted to remember, so it was painted out. But the women knew. They could feel it, especially during formal events, when movement was restricted, when you could not scratch, when your crown had to stay perfectly centered. Every itch became a torment. Every tickle raises a question. Was it lace rubbing your temple, or something else? There were attempts at solutions. Some courts imported powders from the East, claimed they killed lice on contact. Some maids boiled combs in wine. Some noble women shaved their heads entirely and wore wigs full time. But even then, the scalp itched. It always did. It became part of the rhythm of royal life. Comb in the morning, powder at noon, perfume in the evening, scratch when no one was looking, complain only to your closest maid, and wear your crown as if everything beneath it was as serene as your painted smile. The irony was sharp. The most powerful women in the realm could not escape something as small as a louse. They could command armies, sign treaties, order executions, but they could not stop the itch that arrived just before dinner, or the crawling feeling during mass. And still, the court continued. Hair was braided, wigs were fluffed, crowns were polished. The pests endured. So did the women, not because they liked it, but because that was the cost of appearing perfect. And in the next part, we will look beyond the scalp and down the spine. To the corsets, the stays, the layers of fabric that shaped royal bodies into ideals, even if they made breathing an occasional luxury. Underneath the powdered hair and behind the jewelled veil, the royal body was not just a canvas for luxury, but also a prisoner of fashion. Corsets were not soft accessories. They were stiff, tightly laced cages made of whalebone, canvas, and often lined with horsehair. These were not meant to comfort. They were built to reshape, to squeeze the waist, lift the chest, and force the back into an unnatural line of upright elegance, and royal women wore them for hours, sometimes for entire days, sometimes even while sleeping. The discomfort wasn't the worst part. It was what happened beneath the fabric that made things particularly unpleasant. The corset hugged the body so tightly that it prevented proper airflow. Sweat accumulated in hidden folds. Skin rubbed raw. Bruises formed where metal or bone pressed too long. The area under the breasts would often chafe. Rashes bloomed. It wasn't uncommon for a red line to remain long after the corset came off. But the corset didn't come off very often. That was part of the problem. Cleaning these corsets was another issue altogether, because they weren't washed regularly. You couldn't soak something stuffed with whalebone or lined with stiffened fabric. Water would ruin it. So instead, maids would dab them with vinegar, maybe hang them outside to air. If someone had extra funds, they might sprinkle in dried herbs or perfumed powder to mask the smell. But make no mistake, the smell was there. It settled in the seams. It lingered like an old memory. Add to that the layers worn over the corset. Chemises, bodices, dresses made of heavy brocade or velvet. Each layer trapped more heat, more moisture, more odour, and because washing those outer garments was expensive and risky, they weren't cleaned either. So the layers of clothing didn't just sit on the skin. They worked like a slow cooker, keeping everything warm, damp, and unpleasant. Sometimes, fainting wasn't about drama. It was about not being able to breathe. A tightly laced corset could make walking across a room an effort. Dancing during court festivities was a trial. Sitting still in church could feel like an act of endurance. And yet, all the while, you were expected to smile, to radiate poise and grace, even if your ribs ached and your underarms itched. Servants would often whisper that they could tell a lady's rank by her scent, not her perfume, but what lay underneath. A duchess might smell of sandalwood and trapped sweat. A princess might carry hints of rose oil mixed with musty linen. No one said this aloud, but everyone knew. You could recognize a person by the corset-shaped aroma they left behind. For young girls entering court, the corset was introduced early. It was a rite of passage, a symbol that childhood was ending and womanhood was beginning. But no one explained the blisters. No one warned them about the headaches from shallow breaths. They learned quickly and quietly, adjusting their postures, their movements, their expectations. At times, a woman might loosen her laces in private, just a bit, enough to take a deep breath or eat a little more at supper, but that was a luxury, reserved for behind-the-curtain moments. At public banquets or royal audiences, the corset had to stay tight, appearances first, lungs second. Doctors occasionally voiced concern. They wrote about displaced organs and restricted digestion. Some even blamed the corset for miscarriages. But fashion rarely listens to medicine, especially not at court. If the queen laced tight, so did everyone else. No one wanted to be the woman who looked relaxed next to royalty. Relaxed, after all, often meant wide-waisted, and that was not the goal. Wearing the same corset every day also meant sharing your secrets with it. It knew what you ate. It held onto the sense of last night's stew or today's spiced wine. It remembered your sweat, your fear, your stress. And unlike a friend, it never forgot. It held tight, pressed close. Whispers clung to it, the kind you couldn't perfume away. Corset stays would sometimes snap. The sound was sudden, like a bone breaking, and it came with a mix of panic and relief. Panic because someone might notice. Relief because for one blessed moment, your body had a bit more room. Some women carried extras. Others sent maids running, but everyone understood. A broken corset was not a scandal. It was an inevitable part of royal life. When a woman finally removed her corset at the end of the day, her skin bore its memory. Red grooves, damp patches, a sharp contrast between the air outside and the heat trapped underneath. The relief was immediate, but the freedom was short-lived. Tomorrow, it will go back on. The laces would pull tight, the ritual would begin again, and through it all, no one complained. Not really. Complaining made you seem fragile. Fragility made you seem weak. And weakness had no place in royal portraiture. So they endured, with powdered faces, straight backs, and hidden scars. But underneath the corset, underneath the illusion, their bodies were tired, sore, strained. Sometimes, they weren't even sure where their shape ended and the corsets began. In the next part, we'll move even further down, past the bones and bruises, to the feet, where shoes that looked elegant from a distance told a much less glamorous story up close. After corsets came shoes, and while they were rarely the first thing anyone noticed in a royal portrait, they carried more than their share of quiet suffering. Shoes in royal courts were not made for walking, they were designed for showing. They completed the illusion of elegance, the performance of dignity. But when you stepped closer and looked below the silks and brocade hems, what you found was not always so refined. Royal footwear in the past centuries was often made from leather, silk, or velvet stretched over a stiff base. Soles were thin, sometimes just layers of fabric or soft leather stitched together. Heels, if present, were modest and offered little support. There were no cushioned insoles, no arch comfort, just flat resistance pressing up against the foot with every step. And yet these shoes were worn for hours, sometimes for ceremonies that lasted half the day, sometimes while standing still in galleries with cold marble floors. But discomfort wasn't the worst part. What truly turned these royal shoes into hygiene nightmares was how little they were cleaned. Feet, enclosed in tight fabric and pressed against non-breathable linings, would sweat, and that sweat had nowhere to go. The shoes absorbed it, slowly, day after day, without ever being truly aired out. They were rarely washed. If the outside got dirty, it might be brushed. If it smelled, perhaps a sprig of mint or a puff of powder was tucked inside, but the inside that was left to ferment, and so, over time, the shoes took on a life of their own. They began to develop a scent that was neither floral nor faint, a mixture of damp leather, old powder, and something unmistakably human. Each step carried the history of days before, the heat, the stress, the long walks down dark hallways or across sticky palace kitchens. You didn't just wear the shoes, you marinated in them. To make things worse, many royal women were expected to wear stockings underneath. These were not modern cotton blends. They were usually wool or silk, tightly woven and rarely laundered. If a woman had 3 or 4 pairs, she was lucky. Often, she would rotate them, brushing them off after each use. Washing them meant risking damage. So instead, they were hung near the fire or aired near a window, freshened with herbs, but not scrubbed with soap. And it showed. In private, maids sometimes gagged while removing shoes. They learned to hold their breath, to turn their heads, but they never said anything. It was not their place. The mistress might sigh with relief as her feet were freed, but the shoes were placed carefully aside, to be worn again the next day. Over time, feet suffered. Blisters formed and never quite healed. Toenails thickened and yellowed. Some women developed infections between their toes, hidden beneath layers of hose and etiquette. They walked carefully, slowly, not from grace but because of pain, but no one mentioned it. It was considered improper to speak of feet at all, let alone foot odour. That was something reserved for jokes about peasants. not queens, and yet queens suffered too. Some records mention foot baths, small wooden tubs filled with rosewater or vinegar. But these were rare luxuries, not daily habits. The water might be reused by multiple people. Sometimes it sat for hours before use. A warm basin placed before sore feet might offer temporary comfort, but it did not cleanse. It soothed the symptoms without touching the cause. When shoes were finally replaced, they weren't thrown away. They were passed down, given to servants, or stored in boxes, where the scent would surprise the next hand to open them. The smell of age, of rank, of skin. In colder months, the problem worsened. Fireplaces dried out the air, but feet still sweated under layers of wool. In damp castles with stone floors, shoes would grow mildew, a soft white patch along the sole. It was brushed off, ignored. Forgotten until it returned again. Even paintings could not hide it. Look closely at a court scene, and you'll see women seated with one foot half turned, always angled away from the viewer. It looks graceful, but it might just be modesty for something less poetic. Because while faces were powdered and hands were gloved, feet remained stubbornly real, and real meant flawed. Of course, not everyone suffered equally. Some noble women had dozens of shoes, slippers for indoor use, riding boots, embroidered pieces just for banquets. But even then, variety did not mean cleanliness. More often than not, it just meant spreading the problem across more pairs. There were jokes about the smell, quiet ones. A courtier might chuckle to himself after stepping behind a lady who left a particular impression. A musician might swap instruments with a wrinkled nose after standing too close to a shoe bench. But no one laughed too loudly. It was a shared secret. Something that didn't need to be said aloud. And so the shoes continued, passed on, worn down, softened by sweat and memory. Each pair a testimony not just to fashion, but to endurance. And when a woman limped, no one asked. They admired her grace, her elegance, her restraint, even if every step was a reminder that beauty, in the court of kings and queens, had a price, and that price was often paid in silence and in very damp stockings. Next, we'll rise again, away from the feet and towards something far more delicate, a practice that mixed status with discomfort in a way few other things could. Powdered skin, not just for beauty, but for hiding much more than wrinkles. Powdering the face may sound harmless today, a light dusting to reduce shine, maybe to even out the skin. But in royal courts of the past, the powder was more than just a cosmetic touch. It was a mask, a barrier, a symbol of power, status, and control. It was also, unfortunately, one of the most quietly harmful hygiene habits worn proudly by the elite. Let's start with the basics. The white powder most commonly used wasn't some innocent blend of chalk and cornstarch. It was often made from lead, ground into a fine dust, mixed with vinegar or rosewater, and smeared generously onto the skin. The whiter the face, the higher the rank. Pale skin meant you didn't work outdoors. It meant you had people to fetch your food, light your fire, lace your gown. A healthy tan that was for peasants. For royalty, the goal was ghostly. Applying this powder was a daily ritual. A thick base was spread across the forehead, cheeks, and chin. Then came the layers, more powder. Then, sometimes, a bit of colour is added back in with crushed petals or iron oxide to create a blush. The irony was never lost on anyone. Women first wiped out all natural signs of life from their faces, then painted artificial life back on in carefully measured dots and swirls. But underneath all that, the skin couldn't breathe. Pores were clogged. Sweat and oil had nowhere to go. Blemishes formed. Irritations worsened. And then came the problem no one wanted to speak about. The smell. The combination of sweat trapped under lead, mixed with aging perfume and skin oils, gave the powder a scent that didn't fade. Some described it as sour, Others said it reminded them of wet fabric left in the sun, but everyone agreed it lingered. Powdered faces didn't stay pristine. They cracked during long dinners, melted slightly during warm ceremonies. Fine lines became more noticeable as the powder settled into creases, and yet women reapplied, not just once, sometimes 5 or 6 times a day. With each new layer, the weight increased, the air beneath the powder thickened, the skin beneath began to itch. Scratching wasn't an option, not in public, so women used fans, not to cool themselves, but to discreetly tap at their cheeks. A tiny flick here, a soft flutter there. Anything to relieve the crawling sensation under all that product. At night, some attempted to remove the powder. They used vinegar-soaked cloths, or milk, or even urine in rare cases. But it never came off entirely. Some traces always remained, especially along the hairline and around the nose. And so the cycle began again the next day, layer upon layer, irritation upon irritation. Elizabeth, I was a notorious user of white lead makeup. Her face became a canvas of power, but also of secrecy. Underneath that pale mask were scars from smallpox. Her courtiers copied her look, not because they admired her condition, but because they feared falling behind in the fashion game. Looking healthy was less important than looking royal, and looking royal meant looking white. What people didn't realise, or chose to ignore, was that lead was slowly poisoning them. It caused hair loss, headaches, tremors, mood swings. Some even believe it shortens lives. But none of that mattered in the moment. What mattered was the impression, the illusion. A woman might feel faint. Her skin might flake beneath the powder. But as long as the room saw beauty, she had done her duty. The worst was in the summer. Heat mixed with heavy layers of clothing, stale air, and dense cosmetics. Powder mixed with sweat and dripped down collars. Maids tried to pat their mistresses dry without smudging their faces. Some nobles even kept extra collars to change midday. Not for fashion, but to hide what the face left behind. The powder got everywhere. It clung to lace. It stained fans. It settled into the bristles of brushes that were never properly cleaned. Rooms used for dressing eventually smelled like powder and perfume, but with a hint of something sour beneath. The scent of skin under stress, of beauty under siege, and still, no one stopped. The powder was as essential as jewels. More so, even, you might leave your necklace behind, but never your powder box. It was carried in pouches, displayed on dressing tables, and given as gifts. To be without it was to appear unfinished, and being unfinished at court could mean being forgotten. There was also an art to powdering. Too thick, and you looked corpse-like. Too thin, and your natural colour peeked through. Women practised in mirrors, adjusting the light, checking each side of the face. Some hired specialists just for the application. Not physicians, not caretakers, but artists of illusion. But the powder didn't just sit on the skin. It invaded noses, got into mouths, left a chalky taste on the tongue if you licked your lips at the wrong time. And when you sneezed, which happened often thanks to the fine dust, you were expected to turn away gracefully, then reapply discreetly. A powdered woman did not lose her composure, even when her nostrils burned. What made it worse was that once you started using powder, it was hard to stop. The skin underneath grew dependent, paled from lack of sunlight, weakened by blocked pores, red from irritation. Women who tried to go without were often asked if they were ill, because in a world ruled by powdered norms, a natural face looked strange. Suspicion even. So day after day, the powder came back, patted on gently, pressed into the skin, locked in place with layers of perfume and silent expectation. And while it created a beautiful surface, it also created a hiding place, a place where hygiene surrendered to appearance, where the pores cried for air but were told to wait. Next, we'll pull the curtain back on something even more hidden. A part of royal life rarely spoken about, but just as telling, the bed. and everything that lived inside it. Beneath all the silk and splendour, behind the carved bedposts and gold-stitched drapes, there was a truth few talked about, a truth that rustled softly under layers of linen. The royal bed, a place where queens were meant to rest, to dream, to hold court in private, but also a place where hygiene quietly failed, because beneath the glamour of royal bedding was something far less majestic, something that crawled, itched, and scratched when the lights went out. Royal beds were massive. 4 posters, thick canopies, mountains of pillows, and layer upon layer of blankets. Feather mattresses are stacked on top of straw or horsehair foundations. They looked magnificent, regal, fit for the ceremony and portrait painting. But they weren't just uncomfortable. They were ecosystems. Entire little worlds teeming with the life you couldn't always see, but felt. The bedding itself was heavy. Linen sheets, woolen blankets, brocade bedspreads. These fabrics absorbed everything. Sweat, oils, perfume, powder. And they weren't washed as often as one might hope. Washing large pieces of fabric was labour-intensive. Water had to be hauled. Soap was expensive. And drying took days, especially in damp stone castles. So, instead of regular washing, sheets were brushed, shaken out, aired near windows or fireplaces, maybe sprinkled with dried lavender or rose petals to improve the smell. But that was surface treatment. The deeper problem remained untouched. And then came the lice. Not just the kind that lived on the head, but the kind that settled into seams. Body lice. Bed bugs, fleas. They burrowed into the feather-stuffed mattresses and hid in the corners of the wooden frames. They came out at night. You might feel them first as a tickle on the ankle, then a bite on the wrist, red marks that didn't disappear by morning. Women scratched under their nightgowns and then covered the spots with powder by day. No one said anything. Because everyone, even royalty, was dealing with the same discomfort. Sometimes, the court would bring in fumigators. They would burn herbs under the beds or wave incense around the chambers. It masked the scent for a while. It might drive a few creatures away, but it never fully solved the problem. The lice always came back, because no matter how clean the face or fresh the perfume, the beds were still shared by skin and sweat and dust, and royal women weren't always alone in those beds. They shared them with ladies in waiting, with visiting nobles, sometimes even with children. Beds were not private the way we think of them today. They were spaces of diplomacy, of waiting, of whispered conversation, and of collective itching. One woman might roll over in the night only to find that the person beside her had been scratching for hours. The sheets shifted, the blankets grew damp, but no one said a word. To complain was to show weakness. Some tried to protect themselves. They wore linen nightcaps, long-sleeved gowns, woolen socks. They tucked their sleeves tightly and pulled the covers to their chins, but it never kept everything out. In the morning, they would wake with marks on their wrists, hair mussed from tossing and turning, and eyes slightly red from a night that offered more survival than rest. Mattresses were rarely replaced. They were expensive. A feather mattress could last for years, but during those years, it absorbed more than softness, spills, body oils, sometimes even blood. The maids flipped them, beat them with sticks, hung them over railings in the sun, but the sun alone could not undo what had built up over months of human presence. The smell stayed, a mix of musk and something faintly sour, a scent that clung to the back of your throat when you lay down and breathed in too deeply. When royalty travelled, the bedding travelled too. It was packed in carts, hauled across muddy roads, set up again in new chambers, but the same sheets. The same mattresses, the same creatures, hidden and patient, were waiting for nightfall. Sometimes, they even called them chamber companions, a quiet joke among servants who had long since stopped being surprised by what they found between the sheets. Even the act of making the bed was ceremonial. Maids wore gloves. They lifted each layer carefully, smoothed out every fold, placed small bouquets of dried herbs under the pillows, not to freshen the scent, but to ward off pests. But it was a losing battle. The herbs faded, the pests returned, and the queens lay back down, their faces calm, their hands folded, their minds focused on matters of state, even as something tiny moved near their ankles. There were moments of relief. Clean bedding was brought in after the holidays. A new mattress was gifted during a wedding. The smell of sun-dried linen after an unusually warm week. But these moments were rare, fleeting, quickly swallowed by the slow return of warmth, moisture, and human residue. Some royal women suffered in silence. Others became obsessed with bedding rituals, changing sheets more often, demanding herbal fumigations, paying extra for imported linens. But no matter how much they tried, the problem lingered. Because the issue wasn't just the bed, it was the way people lived, close together, poor ventilation, heavy clothing, rare bathing, and all of it followed them under the covers. Looking back, we see these women in portraits, serene, composed, draped in fabric so fine they seem to float. But no one paints the itching. No one sketches the sleepless nights spent swatting at invisible bites, or the quiet shuffle of a maid washing her hands after folding a sweat-soaked sheet. Royalty might have lived grandly, but they also lived with things we've long since banished from our bedrooms. Next, we turn to something even more subtle, something not worn or slept on, but inhaled. Scents meant to impress, fragrances crafted to define power, but behind every royal perfume was a mixture that would make your nose think twice. Perfume, at first glance, seems like the most elegant of luxuries, a soft mist, a floral trail left behind in passing. In royal courts, fragrance was more than vanity. It was present. It walked into the room before a queen did. It lingered after she had gone. But not all perfumes were gentle, and not all scents were pleasant. Behind the polished bottles and gilded labels, perfume was often a desperate response to something that couldn't be ignored. The constant battle against body odour. In a world where daily bathing was rare and washing clothes was a chore, perfume became armour. Royal women relied on it, not just for court appearances, but for everyday survival. Their bodies, wrapped in heavy fabrics, trapped moisture. Their skin, powdered and painted, absorbed smoke and sweat, and with every hour that passed, the layers of scent built up. So they added more. Not water, not soap, but oils, tinctures. Fragrant balms are rubbed onto the wrists, neck, and temples. Sometimes even on the soles of their feet. The ingredients varied depending on wealth and location. Musk was common, often derived from the glands of animals. Sivir, taken from the scent sacs of a small African mammal, added a heavy, earthy note. Ambergris, harvested from the digestive system of sperm whales, brought depth and longevity. Then there were the flowers, rose, jasmine, lavender, all crushed, steeped in alcohol or oil, and bottled carefully. But it was the animal ingredients that made the difference. They helped the scent last, and they helped it cling to skin that hadn't seen water in weeks. Applying perfume was part of the morning routine. A few drops behind the ears. A soaked ribbon was tied around the waist. Gloves dipped in fragrant oils and worn for hours, so the scent would slowly release with each movement. Some women even placed perfumed wax beads in their hair, where the warmth of the scalp would soften them throughout the day. It wasn't just personal. It was public. Perfume showed status. If you could afford it, you flaunted it. If you couldn't, you tried to get close enough to someone who could. The problem, of course, was balance. One layer of perfume might smell lovely. Two could still be charming. But by the time a woman added her third or fourth, the effect began to shift. The scent thickened. It mingled not just with her skin, but with the smells of old powder, worn fabrics, and candle smoke. The result was not always pleasant. Some described it as overwhelming, others said it made them lightheaded, but no one said it out loud. Because in court, smelling strong was better than smelling human. The perfume didn't stay confined to the body. It soaked into gowns, into chairs, into bed linens. Curtains carried it. Gloves passed it between their hands. And over time, it became a signature. People recognized others not just by face or voice, but by scent. A queen's arrival was often sensed before it was seen. A cloud of amber and rose, maybe with a touch of something musky, trailed into the hallway. But perfume had another purpose. It was believed to protect. People thought pleasant smells could guard against disease. Miasma theory, common in the Renaissance, to claim that foul air caused illness. So to stay healthy, one had to breathe sweet air. Royal women clung to this idea. They carried pomanders, small containers filled with herbs and scented resins. These hung from belts, from neck chains, or were clutched in gloved hands during audiences. When entering crowded rooms or passing through cities, they held them close to their noses. It was both ritual and defence. Yet, not all scents were welcomed. The blending of so many different perfumes in tight spaces created a clashing orchestra of smells. A room full of courtiers could smell like a spice market turned sour. Rose clashed with civet. Jasmine battled with musk. And beneath it all, the ever-present hint of unwashed skin. It was a dance of deception. Everyone is trying to outscent everyone else. No one is willing to admit the truth. Servants bore the brunt of it. They were the ones who prepared the oils, who aired out gowns that reeked of last week's perfume, who tried not to cough while brushing fragrant powder from embroidered sleeves. Some developed headaches, others became used to the constant cloud, but none had the luxury to speak. Their job was to enhance the illusion, to pretend the Queen's scent came from flowers alone, and not from hours of desperate masking. There were, of course, accidents. Bottles broke, scents spoiled. Sometimes, the mixture turned rancid in the heat. A perfume that had once smelled like roses began to smell like vinegar and musk. But rather than discard it, women often added more layers. A touch of orange blossom here, a splash of sandalwood there. It was like painting over a stained canvas again and again, hoping the fresh colour would hide what lay beneath. Some queens became known for their signature blends. Elizabeth was said to favour damask rose and cinnamon. Others leaned toward lavender and sage. But even these preferences changed over time. As their bodies aged and their skin changed, so did the way the perfume settled. A fragrance that smelled lovely on one woman might turn sharp and bitter on another. Still, the effort continued, because to appear without scent was to appear undone. And yet, when the perfume faded at the end of the day, the truth always returned. Gowns are heavy with residue, skin coated in oil and powder, bed sheets that smelled less like roses and more like effort. The Queen's scent may have been curated, but it was also layered over something very human, something that perfume could only delay, not erase. Next, we'll step even deeper into royal routine, past the powder, beyond the perfume, into the one ritual that was meant to purify, but often left things worse. The occasional bath and everything that came with it. Bathing was supposed to be the moment of redemption, the great reset, a chance to scrub away the days, the sweat, the scent of everything else. But in royal history, a bath was rarely that simple. It wasn't a daily event. It wasn't even a weekly one. For many queens, it was an ordeal, something planned, prepared, and performed. And despite all the ceremony, it often left them feeling less refreshed than they hoped. To begin with, water had to be hauled in by hand. Buckets filled from rivers, wells, or cisterns, heated slowly over open flames, then poured into large wooden tubs, sometimes lined with fabric or padded with towels. The process took hours. Dozens of servants moved back and forth. The bath had to be just warm enough, not scalding, not cold. Herbs or flower petals were added to mask the natural scent of the water, which was not always fresh. Sometimes it had been stored in barrels for days. Once prepared, the queen was helped into the tub. She did not bathe alone. Maids stood by to sponge, rinse, and fetch more water. Privacy was a luxury not always given, even in these moments, and yet, for all the effort, the cleansing was mostly external. There was no scrubbing in the modern sense, just gentle wiping, gentle dabbing, a little rose oil on the shoulders, a cloth to the feet, but the body, in its fullness, remained more or less untouched. The soap, when used, was different too, not the bubbly, fragrant bars we know today. It was coarse, often made with animal fat and ash. It stung if it got into the eyes. It dried the skin. Some women avoided it altogether, preferring to rely on scented oils to give the illusion of freshness. They would emerge from the bath glistening, not because they were clean, but because they were covered in something meant to smell better than sweat. And there were risks. Bathing was thought to open the pores. Open pores were believed to let in disease. Some doctors advised against it altogether. Better to remain dry and healthy than clean and vulnerable. So many queens bathed only when necessary. Before major ceremonies, weddings, childbirth, a coronation, or when illness made it unavoidable. In between, they relied on other tools. Linen cloths rubbed under the arms, sprigs of rosemary tucked into corsets, powder sprinkled liberally across the back. Even the tubs themselves were suspicious. Wood absorbed moisture and began to smell. Metal grew cold too quickly. Some tubs were lined with leather or cloth to make them more comfortable, but these linings were rarely cleaned between uses, and so the very place meant to purify the body became a trap for bacteria. A bath could leave a woman feeling relaxed, yes, but also itchy, rash, or simply disappointed. And when it was over, the drying process began, slowly, layer by layer. Towels were coarse, not soft. Hair was rarely washed with water, so it remained wrapped in cloth or left untouched. The skin was patted down, then coated again in oils. By the end of it, the queen looked polished, regal, ready for another day at court, but beneath the surface, she carried the same discomfort as before, only now, masked in lavender and sweat. All of this was considered normal, expected. No one believed royalty smelled like soap and rainwater. They smelled like people under pressure, people in brocade, people who had to maintain appearances at all costs. And that maintenance did not include plumbing or hygiene standards. It included an illusion, layers of scent, rituals of dusting, the occasional bath when it could no longer be delayed. So while the palace looked pristine from the outside, it breathed with another rhythm inside, a rhythm of bodies, of warmth, of linen rubbed thin by repeated dabbing, the smell of cinnamon fighting with civet, of rosewater poured over skin that had seen little else, and always, behind it all, the quiet truth. That royal life, for all its pageantry, was not exactly fragrant. When we think of queens, we imagine grace, elegance, hair brushed 100 times, robes trailing behind like clouds. But the real queens of history moved through rooms thick with perfume, powder, and perspiration. They managed households, bore heirs, signed decrees, and smiled through layers of discomfort. And at night, they lay in beds that itched and whispered, beds that held the day's secrets in their seams. Their lives were grand, yes, but also gritty, not because they lacked dignity, but because they lacked plumbing, because their bodies, though wrapped in gold thread, still sweated, still itched, still longed for cool air and a clean sheet. And in this, they were perhaps not so different from anyone else, just a little shinier on the outside. So tonight, as you settle into your bed, take a moment, a small one, and feel grateful for clean pyjamas, for cotton that breathes, for a mattress that does not creak or crawl, for the ability to step into a shower and come out new. These are small things, easy to take for granted, but they are luxuries of a kind, Elizabeth, I could only imagine. The past is fascinating, beautiful, in a way, but also layered in discomfort, a place of power, yes, but also of powder, of scent meant to cover what could not be cleaned. And while history loves to dress up its queens, to show us their crowns and their velvet, it rarely shows us the basin, the cloth, the scratching behind the curtain, and perhaps that is the most human part of all. The reminder that beneath every crown was a head that sometimes just needed to be washed. Thank you for staying with us through the scents, the silks, and the strange habits of history's royal women. May your night be clean, your sheets soft, and your dreams blissfully free of tallow candles and civet oil. Sleep well.